Can you be my date for one day? The desperate rancher's question hung in the dusty air of the general store, his calloused hands trembling as he held out a worn leather pouch of coins. The woman before him, proud, desperate, beautiful, met his eyes with equal parts suspicion and need. Neither knew this single day would shatter everything they thought they understood about love, loss, and second chances. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of sagebrush and regret through the town of Sage Hollow on that October morning in 1887. Lucas McGraw stood at the edge of the wooden sidewalk, his shadow stretching long across the dirt road as the sun climbed reluctantly over the eastern ridge. His hands, rough from years of rope and leather, hung uselessly at his sides. Behind him, tied to the hitching post, his horse stamped and snorted, sensing the anxiety that radiated from its owner like heat from summer stones. Lucas was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains that ringed the valley. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed permanently set in lines of stoic endurance. At 32, silver already threaded through his dark hair at the temples, put there by grief rather than age. His eyes, once bright with the optimism of a young husband and father, had dulled to the color of winter clouds. Those who knew him before Sarah died said he'd left the best parts of himself in her grave 3 years ago. But today, desperation had driven him to do something he'd sworn he'd never do: beg. The harvest blessing was 3 days away. For as long as anyone could remember, the ceremony had marked the end of the growing season, a time when families stood together before the mayor's table to give thanks for the year's bounty and receive blessings for the winter ahead. It was tradition. It was community. It was everything Sage Hollow held sacred. And Ellie refused to go without a mother. His daughter's words from the night before still echoed in his mind with the persistence of a wound that wouldn't close. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table, her small hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes, Sarah's eyes, fixed on the scraped wood surface as if reading prophecy in the grain. "Papa?" she'd whispered, her voice so soft he'd had to crouch beside her chair to hear. "I can't go to the blessing." "Why not, little bird?" He'd used his pet name for her, hoping to coax out whatever fear had taken root in her heart. "Because everyone has a mama. Everyone stands together. And I—" Her voice had cracked, and tears had spilled down her cheeks. "I don't want to be the only one standing alone. I don't want everyone looking at me and remembering that Mama's gone." Lucas had felt his heart fracture a little more, the pieces grinding against each other like broken glass. He'd pulled her into his arms, this tiny, fragile creature who'd barely spoken more than a dozen words a day since Sarah's death, and he'd felt the dampness of her tears soaking through his shirt. "You won't be alone, Ellie. I'll be there with you." But she'd pulled back, shaking her head with a determination that was both heartbreaking and absolute. "It's not the same, Papa. All the other children have mamas who brush their hair and tie their ribbons and hold their hands." Mrs. Patterson says families stand together, a papa and a mama, and their children. That's what the blessing is for. That's what makes it special. Mrs. Patterson, the town busybody whose ideas about propriety and tradition were as rigid as iron fence posts. Lucas had wanted to march over to her house right then and tell her exactly what he thought of her narrow-minded notions, but what would that solve? The damage was done. Ellie had internalized the message that their little family of 2 wasn't complete, wasn't worthy of standing before the community. That night, after tucking Ellie into bed and singing her the lullaby Sarah used to sing, his voice cracking on every note, Lucas had sat at the kitchen table until the candle burned low. The house creaked around him, empty and cold despite the fire in the stove. Every corner held memories of Sarah, her apron still hanging on the hook by the door, her recipe book on the shelf with flowers still dusting the cover, the rocking chair by the window where she'd nursed Ellie while watching the seasons change. He couldn't bring Sarah back. God knew he'd tried in every way a man could try, through prayer, through rage, through the kind of soul-deep bargaining that left him hollow and ashamed. But what he could do, what he had to do, was find a way to give Ellie what she needed, even if just for one day. The idea had come to him sometime around midnight, born of desperation and whiskey and the kind of creative problem-solving that frontier life demanded. If Ellie needed a mother figure for the harvest blessing, then he would find one. Not a replacement for Sarah. That was impossible. But someone kind enough to stand beside them for a few hours, to smile and hold Ellie's hand and let his daughter experience what other children took for granted. He would hire someone to pretend. The thought had felt wrong in a dozen different ways, dishonest and manipulative and probably sacrilegious. But as dawn had broken and he'd watched Ellie sleeping, her small face finally peaceful, he'd known he would do whatever it took. She'd stopped laughing. She'd stopped playing. She barely spoke anymore, communicating mostly through nods and head shakes and those devastating eyes that held too much sorrow for a 4-year-old to carry. If one day of pretending could give her back even a sliver of joy, then he'd sell his soul to make it happen. So here he stood, in front of the general store, preparing to proposition the first suitable woman he could find. The word suitable rattled around in his head like a penny in an empty can. What did that even mean? Someone respectable enough that the town wouldn't talk, or at least wouldn't talk too much. Someone desperate enough to accept such a bizarre arrangement. Someone with enough kindness to be gentle with a wounded child. The morning shoppers moved past him with nods and curious glances. He recognized most of them: the widow Henderson, old man Cartwright, the Larson twins with their mother. This was a town where everyone knew everyone, which made what he was about to do both easier and infinitely more complicated. Lucas took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and pushed open the door to Mackenzie's general store. The bell above the door jangled, and the familiar smells hit him immediately: coffee, tobacco, leather, the sweet, sharp scent of pickle brine from the barrel near the counter. Henry Mackenzie stood behind the register, his round face already flushed with irritation as he argued with someone Lucas couldn't quite see behind a display of canned goods. "I've been more than patient, Miss Winslow, but your father's debt has been outstanding for 8 months now. I can't keep extending credit indefinitely. I have my own bills to pay." "Mr. Mackenzie, I understand your position. Truly, I do." The voice that responded was clear and controlled, with an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. "But as I've explained, my mother is ill. The doctor's bills have consumed every penny we had. I'm working now, teaching at the school, and I will pay you back every cent my father owed. I just need a little more time." "You've been saying that for 2 months, miss. Time doesn't put food on my table or pay my suppliers." Lucas moved closer, curiosity drawing him toward the conversation despite his own mission. As he rounded the display, he got his first clear look at the woman Mackenzie was haranguing. She stood with her back straight as a lodgepole pine, her chin lifted in defiance even as her hands clutched a worn reticule so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was younger than he'd expected from her composed voice, probably mid-20s, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a style that had been neat hours ago but was now coming loose in wisps around her face. Her dress was clean but faded, mended carefully at the seams, the kind of careful poverty that tried desperately to maintain dignity. But it was her eyes that stopped Lucas in his tracks. They were the color of honey held up to sunlight, golden brown and fierce, burning with a pride that refused to be extinguished by circumstances. This was a woman who'd known better days and was fighting with everything she had to climb back to them. "I can give you $10 by the end of the month," she said, her voice never wavering, "and 10 more the month after that. The school board pays me $35 a month. After rent and necessities for my mother, that's what I can manage." Mackenzie snorted. "Your father owed me $87, Miss Winslow. At that rate, it'll take you nearly a year to settle the account." "Then I'll take a year. But I will pay it. My father was a good man who fell on hard times. I won't let his memory be tarnished by unpaid debts." Something in her words struck Lucas like a physical blow. Here was someone who understood loss, who was carrying burdens that threatened to break her, but refused to surrender. Someone who was fighting for family, for honor, for the kind of principles that seemed increasingly rare in a world that valued pragmatism over pride. Before he could second-guess himself, Lucas stepped forward. "Excuse me." Both Mackenzie and the woman, Miss Winslow, turned to look at him. Mackenzie's expression shifted to something between relief and speculation. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, defensive, as if expecting another person to pile on to her troubles. "Mr. McGraw," Mackenzie said, his merchant smile sliding into place. "What can I do for you this morning?" Lucas ignored him, his attention fixed on Miss Winslow. Up close, he could see the shadows under her eyes. The thinness of her face that spoke of too many meals skipped so someone else could eat. But he also saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she refused to look away from his scrutiny. "You're the new school teacher?" he asked. "I am. Clara Winslow." She didn't offer her hand, perhaps sensing that the stranger had somehow overheard her humiliation and was about to make it worse. "And you are?" "Lucas McGraw. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town. My daughter Ellie should be starting school soon. She's 4. He watched Clara's expression shift slightly, some of the defensiveness giving way to curiosity. "Most children don't start until they're 5 or 6. Is there a particular reason?" "She needs to be around other children." Lucas cut her off, not ready to explain the full depth of Ellie's isolation. "She needs to learn that the world is bigger than our ranch." Clara studied him for a long moment, and Lucas had the uncomfortable sensation of being dissected, examined, and catalogued by an intelligence that missed very little. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied some internal criteria, because she nodded slightly. "Then I look forward to having her in my classroom, Mr. McGraw." "That's not why I'm here." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, desperation making him clumsy. He was aware of Mackenzie watching them with undisguised interest, of other shoppers drifting closer, sensing drama. This was a mistake. He should leave, think of another way, find someone else. But Clara was looking at him with those fierce honey eyes, waiting, and something about her pulled the truth out of him like a splinter. "I need to hire someone for a day," he said, his voice dropping low. "The harvest blessing is in 3 days. My daughter needs—" He stopped, frustration building in his chest. How did he explain this without sounding like either a madman or a fool? "Needs what, Mr. McGraw?" Clara's voice had gentled slightly, responding perhaps to the raw desperation she must have heard in his tone. "A mother." The word came out like a confession. "Just for that day. Just to stand with us at the ceremony so she can experience what other children have. Her mother died 3 years ago, and Ellie barely speaks now, and she's terrified of standing up there alone, and He stopped, hearing how insane it all sounded. The store had gone silent. Lucas could feel every eye on him, could imagine the gossip already taking shape like storm clouds on the horizon. The widower McGraw has finally lost his mind, trying to hire a pretend wife. What kind of desperation drives a man to that? But he didn't care about any of them. He was watching Clara's face, trying to read her reaction. She hadn't recoiled in disgust. She hadn't laughed. She simply stood there, processing his words with that same careful intelligence he'd noticed before. "You want to hire me to pretend to be your wife for the harvest blessing," she said slowly, making sure she understood correctly. "Not my wife. Just someone who can stand with us. Someone kind who can hold Ellie's hand and make her feel like she belongs." Lucas pulled out the leather pouch he'd brought, the coins inside clinking softly. "I can pay $50. For 1 day. Just a few hours, really. You'd come to the ranch the day before, stay the night in the guest room, stand with us at the ceremony, and then—" he gestured vaguely. "Then you'd be free to go." $50. He watched the number register in Clara's eyes, watched her quick mind calculate what that could mean. $50 was more than a month's teaching salary. $50 could pay off a significant portion of her father's debt, could buy medicine for her sick mother, could provide breathing room in a life that had clearly offered very little room to breathe. "That's quite a sum for a few hours of play acting," she said carefully. "It's not play acting to Ellie." Lucas's voice came out sharper than he intended. To her, it would be real. To her, it would be everything. Something flickered across Clara's face, sympathy maybe, a recognition of a fellow soul trying desperately to protect someone they loved. She glanced at Mackenzie, who was watching the exchange with undisguised fascination, then back at Lucas. "Might we discuss this outside, Mr. McGraw?" Lucas nodded and followed her out of the store, acutely aware of the whispers that erupted the moment the door closed behind them. On the sidewalk, away from the prying eyes and ears of half the town, Clara turned to face him. The morning sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and for a moment Lucas was struck by how beautiful she was, despite the weariness and worry that lined her face. Not beautiful in the delicate, fragile way Sarah had been, but beautiful in the way of something tempered by fire, stronger, harder, more likely to cut you if you weren't careful. Mr. McGraw, I appreciate that you're in a difficult situation, Clara began, her voice measured and calm. But what you're asking is, it's highly irregular. Some might even say inappropriate. I know. Lucas met her eyes directly. If there was any other way, I wouldn't be asking. But my daughter is drowning in grief, and I can't reach her. She barely eats. She barely speaks. The only thing she's asked for in 3 years is this one thing, to have a mother figure at the harvest blessing. I can't give her back her real mother, but I can give her this. I can give her one day where she doesn't feel broken. Clara's expression softened fractionally. And after that one day? What happens when I leave and she's lost another mother? The question hit Lucas like a punch to the gut because he'd been asking himself the same thing for the past 12 hours. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it'll make things worse. Maybe she'll retreat even further into herself. Or maybe experiencing one moment of normalcy will remind her that life can still hold good things, that she can still feel happy. I'm gambling on maybe, Miss Winslow, because maybe is all I have left. Clara looked away, her gaze drifting toward the mountains that stood sentinel over the valley. Lucas could see the war playing out across her features, practical need battling against principle, desperation wrestling with pride. I heard what Mackenzie said in there, Lucas continued quietly, about your father's debt, about your mother being sick. $50 would help. Is this pity? Clara's eyes snapped back to him, blazing with sudden anger. Because I don't accept charity, Mr. McGraw, no matter how prettily it's dressed up. It's not charity, it's a job. A strange job, granted, but a job nonetheless. I need someone with the grace and kindness to make my daughter feel loved for a few hours. You need money. That's not pity. That's business. Business? Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're asking me to lie to a child, to make her believe something that isn't true. How is that kind? I'm asking you to give her a gift. Lucas stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. One day where she remembers what it feels like to be a normal little girl. One day where she doesn't carry the weight of loss on her shoulders. Is that really so terrible? Clara closed her eyes, and Lucas could see her throat work as she swallowed hard. When she opened them again, the anger had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. You promise it's just one day? Just the ceremony? I promise. One day. You'd arrive the morning before, maybe spend a few hours with Ellie so she's comfortable with you, stay the night, attend the ceremony the next day, and then you're free to return to your life. No expectations beyond that. And you'd pay me $50. Yes. Clara was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something Lucas couldn't see. He wanted to press, to push, to beg if necessary, but instinct told him this was a woman who made her own decisions in her own time. Rushing her would only drive her away. Finally, she turned back to him, and Lucas saw that she'd made her choice, though it clearly cost her something to do it. $60? She said. Lucas blinked, surprised. What? If I'm going to compromise my principles, risk my reputation, and potentially cause emotional harm to a child I haven't even met, then the price is $60, $50 for me, and $10 to pay toward my father's debt immediately, so Mr. Mackenzie stops looking at me like I'm a thief every time I walk into his store. A slow smile tugged at the corner of Lucas's mouth, the first real smile he'd felt in longer than he could remember. This woman had steel in her spine and the negotiating instincts of a horse trader. Ellie could do worse than spending a day in her company. $60, he agreed, pulling out the pouch and counting out coins into her palm. 10 now for Mackenzie. The remaining 50 when you leave after the ceremony. Clara stared down at the coins in her hand as if they might vanish like morning mist. Then she closed her fingers around them tightly and looked up at Lucas with those fierce, honey-colored eyes. One day, Mr. McGraw, I'll arrive at your ranch the morning before the harvest blessing. I'll be kind to your daughter. I'll stand with you at the ceremony, and then I'll leave. Is that clear? Crystal clear. And you'll tell your daughter the truth beforehand. I won't be part of an outright deception. She needs to understand that this is temporary. Lucas hesitated. He'd planned to let Ellie believe whatever she needed to believe, to let the fantasy exist unchallenged for as long as it could. But Clara was right. A lie like that would only hurt more when the truth inevitably came out. "I'll talk to her," he promised. "I'll explain that you're helping us for the day." "Good." Clara squared her shoulders, that invisible armor sliding back into place. "Then we have an agreement. I'll see you the day after tomorrow, Mr. McGraw." She started to turn away, but Lucas caught her arm gently. She froze, looking down at his hand on her sleeve, then up at his face with an expression of wary surprise. "Thank you," Lucas said quietly. "I know this is strange, and I know you're doing it for the money, but thank you. You're giving my daughter something I couldn't give her on my own." Something shifted in Claire's expression, the hardness softening just enough for Lucas to glimpse the woman beneath the armor. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. McGraw. We'll see if this turns out to be kindness or cruelty." Then she pulled away gently and walked back into the store, leaving Lucas standing alone on the sidewalk with an agreement that felt both like the answer to his prayers and the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. He stood there for several minutes, watching the people of Sage Hollow go about their morning business, and wondered what exactly he'd just set in motion. The practical part of his brain, the rancher's part that dealt in facts and logistics, told him he'd just solved a problem. He'd found someone to fulfill Ellie's wish, someone respectable and kind who would play her part and then disappear from their lives. But another part of him, the part that still remembered how to feel things deeper than surface-level survival, whispered that nothing was ever that simple. That a woman like Clara Winslow, proud, fierce, desperate, and brave, wasn't someone who could pass through a life without leaving marks behind. Lucas climbed onto his horse and turned toward home, the leather pouch considerably lighter in his pocket, his heart somehow both heavier and lighter than it had been that morning. In 2 days, Clara Winslow would walk onto his ranch and into Ellie's life. One day, he'd promised. Just one day. But as Lucas rode through the sagebrush and dust toward home, the mountains standing witness to deals both made and yet to be understood, he couldn't shake the feeling that one day might not be nearly enough, or that it might be far too much. The consequences were already in motion, rolling forward like a wagon with broken brakes heading downhill. All he could do now was hold on and pray that when they reached the bottom, the wreckage wouldn't be more than they could survive. Behind him, in the general store, Clara Winslow stood at the counter, placing 10 silver dollars in front of Henry Mackenzie with hands that shook only slightly. The merchant's eyes widened as he counted the coins, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. "Well, Miss Winslow, this is unexpected. If you can keep up payments like this—" "I can," Clara interrupted, her voice steady even though her insides churned with doubt and dread, and a strange flutter of something that might have been hope if she'd still known how to recognize it. "I can, and I will." As she left the store, the weight of her father's debt slightly lighter, Clara thought about the promise she'd just made. One day of pretending to be something she wasn't. One day of playing house with a desperate man and his wounded child. One day that would earn her enough money to breathe a little easier, to maybe take her mother to a better doctor, to stop feeling like she was drowning in an ocean of obligations and regrets. One day. What harm could it possibly do? But as she walked back toward the small, rented room she shared with her ailing mother, Clara felt the first whisper of warning flutter through her chest. She'd learned the hard way that bargains made in desperation rarely ended well, that temporary arrangements had a way of becoming permanent complications, that the things we tell ourselves are just for one day have a habit of stretching into forever, whether we want them to or not. She'd survived one scandal already, back in Philadelphia. She'd survived the whispers and the pointed fingers, and the way her so-called friends had dropped her like a hot coal when her reputation had been damaged through no fault of her own. She'd survived losing her teaching position, her father's death from a heart weakened by shame, the desperate flight west to start over in a place where no one knew her story. She'd survived all of that by being careful, by guarding herself, by never letting anyone close enough to hurt her again. And now she was walking straight into a situation that screamed danger in every possible way. Attaching herself, even temporarily, to a man and child who needed her for all the wrong reasons. Pretending to be something she wasn't. Opening herself up to exactly the kind of gossip and speculation she'd been trying so hard to outrun. Clara climbed the narrow stairs to her room, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her mother was asleep when she entered, her breathing labored but steady, her face pale against the pillow. Clara set the remaining coins on the small table and sank into the chair by the window, looking out over the town that was supposed to be her fresh start. $60. For one day. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing she was about to jump but unable to see the bottom through the darkness below. "God help me," Clara whispered to the empty room, to her sleeping mother, to the mountains that had no answers to give. "God help us all." Outside, the wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning down the main street of Sage Hollow. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The town went about its business, unaware that the pieces of something momentous were falling into place, that a one-day agreement made in desperation would ripple outward in ways no one could predict. In 2 days, Clara Winslow would ride out to the McGraw Ranch. In 2 days, Lucas McGraw would introduce her to the daughter he'd move heaven and earth to protect. In 2 days, a chain of events would begin that would test every assumption they'd made about what love could look like, about what families could be, about what it meant to let yourself need someone when needing was the most dangerous thing you could do. Just one day they'd promised each other. But some promises are made to be broken, and some days are meant to last forever, whether you're ready for them or not. The story had begun. The players were in motion, and somewhere in the space between a desperate father's love and a proud woman's need, something neither of them expected was about to bloom. Something fragile and fierce and utterly transformative. One day. It would have to be enough. It would have to be everything. Because in Sage Hollow, Wyoming, in the fall of 1887, there were no second chances. There was only now, and the courage to reach for what you needed, even when reaching felt like the scariest thing in the world. The wind carried their fates forward on invisible wings, and all they could do was wait for what came next. 2 days passed like sand through an hourglass. Inevitable, measured, carrying Lucas closer to a moment he couldn't quite prepare for. He'd spent those 48 hours trying to explain the unexplainable to a 4-year-old who understood loss far better than she should have. The conversation had happened the evening after his trip to town, with Ellie sitting cross-legged on her bed, her worn cloth doll clutched against her chest. Lucas had knelt on the floor beside her, his hands folded in his lap to keep them from shaking. "Little bird, I need to talk to you about the harvest blessing." Ellie's eyes had lifted to his face, hope and fear warring in those dark depths that mirrored Sarah's so perfectly it sometimes hurt to look at her. "I found someone who can help us," Lucas had continued carefully. "A nice lady named Miss Winslow. She's going to come stay with us for a day, and she'll stand with us at the ceremony." "Like a mama?" Ellie's whisper had been so soft he'd barely heard it. "Like a friend who's helping us," Lucas had corrected gently. "She's not your mama, Ellie. She can't be. But she's kind, and she wants to make sure you don't feel alone at the blessing." Ellie had processed this with the serious contemplation of someone far older than her years. "Will she leave after?" The question had pierced Lucas's heart. "Yes, sweetheart. She has her own life, her own family to take care of. This is just for one day." "One day," Ellie had repeated, testing the words. Then, unexpectedly, she'd nodded. "That's okay, Papa. One day is more than nothing." The simple wisdom of it had nearly broken him. His daughter had learned to accept scraps because scraps were all the world seemed willing to offer her. Now, standing on his porch in the early morning light, watching the road that led from town, Lucas wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of dried grass and distant pine. His ranch stretched out before him, 200 acres of grazing land, a sturdy barn, corrals for the horses, and the house he'd built with his own hands 7 years ago when he'd brought Sarah home as a bride. Everything was ready. He'd cleaned the guest room until it gleamed, changed the sheets, placed fresh wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. The house itself was tidier than it had been in months. Floors swept, dishes washed, surfaces cleared of the accumulated debris of 2 people living in survival mode rather than actually living. He'd even baked bread that morning, following Sarah's recipe with hands that remembered the motions, even if his heart stumbled over the memories. Ellie stood beside him now, wearing her best dress, a blue cotton thing with white flowers that was getting too small, but still looked sweet with her dark hair braided and tied with a ribbon. She'd insisted on this ribbon. She'd also insisted on clutching a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers she'd picked herself. "For Miss Winslow," she'd explained, "so she knows we're happy she's coming." Lucas had to turn away to hide the sudden burning in his eyes. His daughter, who barely spoke, who'd retreated so far into herself he'd feared he'd lost her completely, was emerging just enough to offer kindness to a stranger. Maybe this would work. Maybe Clara Winslow would be the key that unlocked whatever door had closed inside Ellie's heart. Or maybe he was a fool grasping at straws while his daughter drowned. "Papa, is that her?" Ellie's voice pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Lucas looked up and saw a small figure on horseback cresting the hill that marked the edge of his property. Even from a distance, he recognized the straight-backed posture, the way she sat in the saddle with the confidence of someone who'd spent plenty of time on horseback. Clara Winslow was punctual, he'd give her that. As she drew closer, Lucas could make out more details. She wore a simple traveling dress in deep green, practical and sturdy, with a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. Her hair was pinned up neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and a small carpet bag was tied behind her saddle. She looked every inch the respectable schoolteacher, nothing about her appearance suggesting anything improper about this arrangement. Clara reined in her horse at the base of the porch steps, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. In the daylight, away from the tension of the general store, Lucas could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably no more than 25, with fine features and a dusting of freckles across her nose that her bonnet couldn't quite hide. But it was her eyes that held him, those honey-gold eyes that seemed to catalog everything, missing nothing, judging and measuring and deciding all at once. "Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I hope I'm not too early." "Right on time," Lucas replied, stepping down from the porch. He moved to help her dismount, offering his hand, which she accepted with the briefest hesitation before swinging down from the saddle with practiced ease. Up close, he caught the scent of lavender soap and noticed the careful mending on her sleeve, nearly invisible, but there if you knew to look. Every detail about Clara Winslow spoke of someone trying desperately to maintain dignity in the face of reduced circumstances. Lucas understood that struggle more intimately than she could know. "This is Ellie," he said, gesturing to his daughter, who still stood on the porch, suddenly shy now that the moment had arrived. Clara turned her attention to the little girl, and Lucas watched something shift in her expression, the careful guardedness softening into genuine warmth. She climbed the porch steps slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal, and then crouched down so she was at Ellie's eye level. "Hello, Ellie," Clara said gently. "It's lovely to meet you. I'm Miss Winslow, but you can call me Clara if you'd like." Ellie stared at her for a long moment, those serious eyes examining this stranger who'd come to play a role in their carefully scripted day. Then, slowly, she extended the bouquet of wildflowers. "These are for you," Ellie whispered. "To say welcome." Clara took the flowers with a reverence that seemed entirely genuine, bringing them to her nose and inhaling deeply. "They're beautiful, Ellie. Thank you. I'll put them in my room so I can see them first thing when I wake up tomorrow. Would that be all right?" Ellie nodded, and a small smile, the first Lucas had seen in days, tugged at the corner of her mouth. Something loosened in Lucas's chest, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Maybe this would be all right. Maybe Clara's kindness wasn't just an act for the money. Maybe she genuinely possessed the warmth that Ellie needed, even if only for 24 hours. "Let me show you to your room," Lucas said, moving to untie Clara's bag from her saddle. "Then maybe we can have some breakfast. I made bread this morning, and there's coffee on the stove." Clara stood, still holding Ellie's flowers like they were precious, and followed him into the house. Lucas was acutely aware of how she must be seeing his home. The worn furniture. The bare walls where Sarah's paintings had once hung before he'd taken them down because seeing them hurt too much. The sense of a place where people existed rather than lived. He tried to clean, tried to make it welcoming, but you couldn't hide years of grief with a day of dusting. But if Clara noticed the melancholy that soaked the walls like old smoke, she gave no sign. She simply followed him through the main room, past the kitchen where the bread cooled on the counter, and down the short hallway to the guest room. "It's not much," Lucas said, opening the door and setting her bag on the chair by the window. "But the bed's comfortable, and you'll have privacy. The necessary is out back, and there's fresh water in the pitcher." Clara stepped into the room, and Lucas saw her take in the freshly made bed, the wildflowers he'd placed on the dresser, the curtains he'd washed and rehung just yesterday. When she turned back to him, something in her expression had changed. The careful armor she wore had developed a small crack. "It's lovely," she said quietly. "Thank you for going to such trouble. It's the least I could do, considering—" Lucas gestured vaguely, unable to find words for the strangeness of their arrangement. "Considering you're paying me to pretend to be part of your family?" Clara's voice held no judgment, just a straightforward acknowledgement of the truth they were both dancing around. "Something like that." An awkward silence settled between them, filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. It was broken by Ellie appearing in the doorway, her earlier shyness apparently overcome by curiosity. "Miss Clara, would you like to see my room?" she asked, her voice still soft but carrying a hint of eagerness that Lucas hadn't heard in months. Clara's face lit up with what looked like genuine pleasure. "I would love to see your room, Ellie. Would you show me?" Ellie took Clara's hand, just reached out and took it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and led her back down the hallway. Lucas followed at a distance, watching as his daughter pushed open the door to her small room and pulled Clara inside. "This is where I sleep," Ellie explained, pointing to her narrow bed with its patchwork quilt. "And that's my toy box. And that's the window where Papa says I can see the stars at night if I'm very quiet." Clara moved through the room with genuine interest, examining the few toys Ellie owned, the drawings pinned to the wall, the wooden horse Lucas had carved for her last Christmas. She picked up the worn cloth doll from the bed, handling it with care. "What's her name?" Clara asked. "Rose. Like Mama's favorite flower." Ellie's voice dropped on the word Mama, and Lucas saw Clara's fingers tighten fractionally on the doll. "Rose is a beautiful name," Clara said gently, setting the doll back down. "Your mama must have loved roses very much." "She did. Papa says she planted them all around the house, but they died when she died." Ellie spoke with the matter-of-fact tone children use when discussing things they don't fully understand but have accepted as immutable truth. Lucas felt his throat close. He hadn't realized Ellie had noticed the roses dying, had connected their withering to Sarah's death. It was such a small thing, such a painfully observant thing, and it broke something inside him all over again. Clara looked up and caught his eye, and in her gaze he saw understanding, not pity, but genuine comprehension of how grief could manifest in 1,000 tiny deaths beyond the primary loss. She turned back to Ellie, crouching down again so they were face to face. "You know what I think?" Clara said softly. "I think roses are strong, stronger than most people give them credit for. Sometimes they die back in the winter and you think they're gone forever, but then spring comes and they bloom again. Maybe your mama's roses just need someone to care for them. Maybe they're waiting for the right person to help them remember how to grow." Ellie's eyes widened. "Could we make them bloom again?" "We could certainly try. Would you like to look at them with me later? See if any of them might still be alive under all that dead wood?" Ellie nodded vigorously, more animation in her face than Lucas had seen since before Sarah died. He wanted to warn Clara not to make promises she couldn't keep, not to give Ellie hope about things that might be impossible. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the careful way Clara phrased it. "We could try," rather than, "I can fix this." Maybe it was seeing his daughter excited about something, anything. Or maybe it was just the desperate hope that this woman might actually be able to reach Ellie in ways he couldn't. "Come on," Lucas said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Let's have that breakfast before everything gets cold." They gathered in the kitchen, and Lucas busied himself slicing bread, pouring coffee, setting out butter and jam. Ellie chattered to Clara about the chickens, about her papa's horses, about the hawk that sometimes circled over the barn. Small talk, inconsequential things, but the sound of his daughter's voice filling the house felt like music after years of silence. Clara listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions that drew Ellie out further, smiling at the little girl's earnest explanations of ranch life. She ate the bread Lucas offered with appreciation, and when she caught his eye across the table, something passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that this strange arrangement might actually work. After breakfast, Ellie insisted on showing Clara the barn, the chickens, the vegetable garden that Lucas kept more out of necessity than any real skill for growing things. Clara followed gamely, her dress getting dusty, her carefully pinned hair coming loose in wisps, but never complaining. She admired Ellie's favorite hen, listened to stories about each horse, and examined the sorry state of Lucas's squash plants with diplomatic tact. "You're not much of a gardener, are you, Mr. McGraw?" she observed, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I can keep things alive," Lucas said defensively. "Barely, but making them thrive? That was always Sarah's gift." The name hung in the air between them, and Lucas immediately regretted bringing it up. But Clara simply nodded, understanding written in the set of her shoulders. "It's hard to nurture things when you're just trying to survive," she said quietly, and Lucas knew she wasn't just talking about vegetables. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Lucas found himself relaxing incrementally. Clara moved through his home and his daily routines with an ease that surprised him. She wasn't trying to be Sarah, thank God for that, but she also wasn't awkward or intrusive. She simply existed in their space with a naturalness that made the house feel less empty. When Ellie asked if they could look at the roses, Clara agreed immediately. They walked around the perimeter of the house, examining the skeletal remains of what had once been Sarah's pride and joy. Most were clearly dead, brown and brittle, but Clara pointed out several that still had green wood near the base. "These ones," she said to Ellie, "these might come back with the right care. We'd need to prune away all the dead parts, make sure they get enough water, maybe add some manure around the roots before winter sets in." "Can we do it now?" Ellie asked, bouncing on her toes with an excitement that made Lucas's chest ache. Clara glanced at Lucas, a question in her eyes. He wanted to say no, wanted to protect those dead roses because they were another connection to Sarah, and bringing them back to life felt like erasing her memory. But then he looked at his daughter's face, saw hope there for the first time in so long, and he couldn't deny her. "We can try," he said, his voice rough. "I've got pruning shears in the barn." The next 2 hours were spent in the kind of work that was both mundane and profound. Clara showed Ellie how to identify dead wood versus living tissue, how to cut at an angle, how to be gentle with the surviving plants. Lucas found himself drawn into the work despite his reservations, cutting away the brittle skeletons of bushes that had once produced blooms Sarah would cut and bring inside, filling the house with fragrance and color. As he worked, he listened to Clara talking softly to Ellie, explaining plant biology in terms a 4-year-old could understand, telling stories about her own mother's garden back in Philadelphia. Her voice was soothing, confident, the voice of someone who knew how to teach, how to make learning feel like discovery rather than lecture. "Did you always want to be a teacher?" Lucas found himself asking during a lull in the work. Clara paused in her pruning, a small smile playing at her lips. "Not always. When I was very young, I wanted to be a piano player. I had visions of playing in grand concert halls, wearing beautiful gowns, receiving standing ovations." She laughed softly. "Childish dreams. Reality is somewhat less glamorous." "What happened?" Lucas asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "No, it's all right." Clara resumed her cutting, her hands steady. "My father lost his business, bad investments, and then a partner who embezzled most of what was left. We went from comfort to poverty almost overnight. Piano lessons became an impossible luxury. I was 17. I had to find a way to support the family." "So you became a teacher?" "I became a lot of things. A seamstress, a lady's companion, a governess. Teaching was actually the best of all the options available to me. At least it used my education, gave me some dignity." She glanced at Ellie, making sure the child was absorbed in her own rosebush before continuing in a lower voice. "And then there was a scandal that wasn't my fault, but became my burden anyway. A man who wouldn't take no for an answer, and a society that blamed me for his persistence. We had to leave Philadelphia. Father died on the journey west. The shame broke something in him, and now Mother and I are here, starting over, trying to outrun the past." Lucas absorbed this quietly, understanding more now about the steel in Clara's spine, the way she held herself like someone always ready for the next blow. She'd survived her own crucibles, carried her own losses. That's why she hadn't flinched when he'd made his bizarre proposition. She understood desperation intimately. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for what you've been through." Clara looked at him directly, and he saw something shift in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of shared wounds. "We all carry things, Mr. McGraw. The trick is learning how to carry them without letting them crush us." Before Lucas could respond, Ellie's voice rang out with pure joy. "Papa, Miss Clara, look, this one has a tiny green leaf." They both turned to where Ellie was pointing at a small bud of new growth emerging from one of the rose bushes they'd just pruned. It was tiny, barely there, but unmistakably alive. "Well, look at that," Clara said, genuine delight in her voice. "Your mama's roses aren't ready to give up yet, Ellie, just like you." The parallel wasn't lost on Lucas. He watched his daughter stroke the tiny leaf with one gentle finger, saw wonder on her face, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Some part of himself he'd sealed away when Sarah died, some capacity for hope he'd thought was gone forever. That evening, as the sun sank toward the mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Clara helped Lucas prepare dinner. It was simple fare: beans, cornbread, dried beef, but having someone else moving through the kitchen, someone to talk to while he cooked, made it feel less like survival and more like living. Ellie set the table without being asked, placing wildflowers in the center as decoration. They ate together as the light faded, and Lucas couldn't help but notice how natural it felt. The three of them around the table, passing dishes, sharing conversation. This was what he'd wanted to give Ellie, the sense of family, of completeness. Even if it was temporary. Even if it was purchased. After dinner, Clara suggested reading Ellie a bedtime story. They settled in the main room, Ellie curled against Clara's side on the worn sofa, while Clara read from a book of fairy tales in a voice that brought the words to life. Lucas sat nearby, ostensibly mending a bridle but really just watching them, memorizing the picture they made, his daughter's dark head against Clara's shoulder, the firelight playing across both their faces, the sense of peace that had descended over his home like a benediction. When the story ended and Ellie's eyes were drooping, Lucas carried her to bed. But as he started to tuck her in, she reached up and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Papa," she whispered against his ear, "I like Miss Clara. She makes the sad feel smaller." Lucas's throat closed completely. He could only nod and hold his daughter close, breathing in the little girl's scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. When he returned to the main room, Clara was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. She'd unpinned her hair, and it fell in waves down her back, catching the firelight in shades of auburn and gold. For a moment, Lucas just stood there, struck by the picture she made. This strong, damaged woman who'd walked into his home and, in the span of a single day, had begun to heal things he'd thought were broken beyond repair. "She's asleep?" Clara asked without turning. "Out like a light. You wore her out." Lucas moved to stand beside her at the window. "Thank you, for today, for being so kind to her." "I wasn't pretending," Clara said quietly. "About that part, at least. She's a lovely child, Mr. McGraw. You've done well with her, despite—" She gestured vaguely, meaning all the grief, all the hardship, all the ways he'd been fumbling through fatherhood alone. "I haven't done well. I've kept her alive, but that's not the same as helping her thrive." Lucas heard the bitterness in his own voice and tried to soften it. "Today was the first time in 3 years she's seemed like a normal little girl. That's because of you." Clara finally turned to face him, and in the firelight, her eyes were impossibly warm, full of something he couldn't quite name. "Don't give me too much credit. I'm just a stranger passing through. Tomorrow, after the ceremony, I'll be gone, and you'll go back to just the two of you." "That's the agreement," Lucas acknowledged. But something in his chest twisted at the thought. One day. That's all they'd promised each other. So why did the idea of Clara leaving suddenly feel like another loss he wasn't prepared to bear? "I should retire," Clara said, breaking the moment. "It's been a long day, and tomorrow will be longer." "Of course." Lucas stepped back, giving her space. "If you need anything during the night, just call out. I'm a light sleeper." Clara nodded and started toward her room, but paused in the doorway. "Mr. McGraw? Lucas?" The use of his first name startled them both. "What you're doing for Ellie, giving her this experience, trying to show her that life can still hold good things. It matters. Even if it's just for one day, don't doubt that. Then she disappeared into her room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Lucas alone with the dying fire and a confusion of emotions he had no idea how to untangle. He sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the house settle around him. Somewhere in the back bedroom, Clara was presumably sleeping in the bed he'd prepared for her. Down the hall, Ellie slept more peacefully than she had in months, and here he sat, caught between gratitude and guilt, relief and a growing dread of the moment when this temporary illusion would end. One day, he'd told himself, just one day of pretending, and then everything would go back to normal. But as Lucas finally rose and headed to his own cold bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be normal again. Clara Winslow had walked into his life with a bargain and a borrowed kindness, and in less than 24 hours she'd begun to reshape everything he thought he knew about moving forward. Tomorrow, they would stand before the town at the Harvest Blessing. Tomorrow, for a few brief hours, they would look like a family. And then tomorrow night, Clara would leave, taking with her the warmth and light and hope she'd kindled in his home. It was the agreement. It was what he'd paid for. It was what they'd both promised. So why did it feel like he was preparing for a goodbye he wasn't ready to say? Lucas closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept circling back to honey gold eyes and the sound of his daughter's laughter, to capable hands pruning rose bushes and a voice that made fairy tales come alive. One day. How had one day become so impossibly precious? The night stretched on, full of questions Lucas couldn't answer and fears he couldn't name. Tomorrow would come, as tomorrow always did. The ceremony would happen. And then the reckoning. The moment when temporary became permanent in all the wrong ways. When pretending ended and reality rushed back in to fill the spaces that hope had briefly occupied. He should never have done this. He should never have thought one day of borrowed happiness could be anything but cruel in the end. But it was too late now. The wheels were in motion. All Lucas could do was hold on and pray that when the day ended, Ellie would remember the joy rather than the loss, and pray that he could do the same. Dawn broke over the McGraw ranch with a clarity that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. Lucas had been awake for hours, lying in bed and watching the darkness slowly give way to gray, then pink, then the pale gold of early morning. Today was the harvest blessing. Today, he would stand before the entire town with Clara at his side and Ellie between them, playing out the charade he'd orchestrated. Today, his daughter would get the experience she'd been desperately craving. And tonight, it would all be over. He rose and dressed in his Sunday clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, a vest that Sarah had made for him years ago with her careful stitches. His hand shook slightly as he buttoned it, and he had to stop twice to steady himself. This was what he'd wanted. This was the plan. So why did his chest feel like it was being squeezed in a vice? The house was quiet when he emerged from his room, but he could hear movement in the kitchen. Following the sounds, he found Clara already up and dressed, her hair pinned in an elaborate style he'd never seen before, making coffee at the stove as if she'd been doing it in his kitchen for years rather than a single day. She wore a dress he hadn't seen yesterday, deep blue with ivory trim, simple but elegant, clearly her best. It brought out the gold in her eyes and made her look like something from one of Ellie's fairy tales. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the kitchen. "I hope you don't mind," Clara said, gesturing to the coffee. "I'm an early riser, and I thought—" "It's fine," Lucas interrupted, his voice rougher than he intended. "Thank you." They moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning new steps, as Clara poured coffee and Lucas started breakfast. The silence between them wasn't entirely comfortable, weighted as it was with everything unsaid, with the knowledge that today would fundamentally change something even if they couldn't quite articulate what. "Are you nervous?" Clara asked finally, setting a cup in front of him. "About the ceremony? No, about—" Lucas gestured vaguely, meaning Ellie, meaning the aftermath, meaning all the ways this could go wrong. "Yes," Clara nodded, understanding implicit in the small movement. "I've been thinking about what happens after, about how to make this easier for her when I leave." Lucas's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "And?" "I could write to her. Not often, that would be cruel, giving her false hope. But perhaps once a month? Just a short note letting her know I'm thinking of her, that today mattered to me too. It might help her understand that caring about someone doesn't always mean staying with them. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Lucas felt his throat close. You'd do that? Even after today? I told you yesterday. I wasn't pretending about caring for her. She's a remarkable child, Lucas. She deserves to know that the people who see that don't simply forget her when they walk away. The use of his first name again sent something warm through his chest, dangerous and complicated. He met Clara's eyes and saw an echo of his own confusion reflected there. This thing between them that had started as a transaction but was becoming something neither of them knew how to name. The moment was broken by the sound of small feet padding down the hallway. Ellie appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, clutching her cloth doll. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice carrying equal parts excitement and anxiety. "Almost, little bird," Lucas said, setting down his coffee and opening his arms. Ellie ran to him, and he lifted her onto his lap, breathing in the sleepy, warm scent of her. "First we eat breakfast, then I'll braid your hair the way Mama used to." "Can Miss Clara do it?" Ellie interrupted, turning to look at Clara with hopeful eyes. "She knows how to make it pretty." Lucas felt Clara's gaze on him, asking permission. He nodded, something in his chest both loosening and tightening at the same time. After breakfast, Clara sat Ellie in a chair and began working through her hair with gentle fingers. Lucas watched from the doorway as Clara braided and pinned, talking softly to Ellie about the ceremony, about what to expect, about how proud she was of how brave Ellie was being. "Now," Clara said, producing a ribbon from her pocket. Not one of Ellie's worn ones, but a new one, deep blue to match her dress. "The finishing touch." She tied it carefully, then turned Ellie toward the small mirror on the wall. The little girl's eyes widened as she took in her reflection. Hair perfect, dress neat, ribbon gleaming. She looked like any other child preparing for a special occasion. She looked whole. "I look like the other girls," Ellie whispered, wonder in her voice. "You look beautiful," Clara corrected gently. "Just like you always do. The ribbon just helps you see it." Lucas had to turn away, overcome by emotions he couldn't contain. This was what he'd wanted for Ellie, this moment of feeling normal, of seeing herself as something other than broken. And Clara had given it to her with a simple ribbon and words spoken with genuine warmth. The ride into town was quiet. The three of them squeezed onto the wagon bench. Lucas drove, with Ellie between him and Clara, the child's hand tucked securely in Clara's. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect autumn weather, and the road was already filling with other families heading to the town square for the ceremony. As they drew closer, Lucas became aware of the stares, the whispered conversations that stopped when they passed, the way heads turned to watch them. News traveled fast in Sage Hollow. Everyone would know by now that the widower McGraw was bringing someone to the harvest blessing. Everyone would be speculating about who Clara was, what this meant, whether the lonely rancher had finally found someone to fill the hole his wife's death had left. Let them talk, Lucas thought grimly. After today, Clara would be gone, and the gossip would die down eventually. Everything would return to normal. Except he was beginning to realize that normal wasn't something he wanted anymore. Normal meant the cold house and the silent dinners and Ellie's hollow eyes. Normal meant surviving rather than living. And these past 2 days, however artificial, had reminded him that life could be something more. They arrived at the town square to find it already filling with people. The mayor's table was set up at the front, decorated with autumn leaves and corn stalks. Families were gathering in clusters, children running and playing, adults exchanging news and pleasantries. The air smelled of wood smoke and the pies that various families had brought for the communal meal that would follow the ceremony. Lucas helped Clara down from the wagon, then lifted Ellie. As his boots hit the ground with his daughter in his arms, he became acutely aware of the attention focused on them. Mrs. Patterson stood with a group of women near the church steps, all of them watching with undisguised curiosity. Henry Mackenzie was there too, probably having spread the word about Lucas's strange transaction in his store. Even Reverend Williams was observing them with a thoughtful expression that Lucas couldn't quite read. "Ready?" Clara asked softly, straightening her shawl and lifting her chin in that way she had, preparing for battle disguised as social niceties. "As will ever be," Lucas replied. They moved through the crowd as a unit, acknowledging greetings, fielding questions. Lucas deflected with practiced vagueness. Yes, this was Miss Winslow. Yes, she was Ellie's new teacher. No, he wasn't sure how long she'd be staying in the area. The lies felt heavy on his tongue, made worse by the fact that they weren't entirely lies. After today, who knew what the truth would even be? Mayor Hutchins, a portly man with impressive mutton chops and a fondness for long-winded speeches, called everyone to order. Families began arranging themselves in rows before the table, parents with children, young couples, elderly relatives all mixed together in the tapestry of community that made Sage Hollow function. Lucas found a spot near the middle, not too prominent, but not hiding at the back either. Clara stood on his left, Ellie between them, and as the child's small hands reached up to grasp both his and Clara's, Lucas felt something shift in the air around them. They looked like a family. They felt like a family, at least to him, and from the way people were watching them, some with approval, some with suspicion, most with simple curiosity, everyone else saw it too. The mayor began his speech, thanking the community for another successful harvest season, acknowledging the challenges they'd faced, celebrating the births and mourning the deaths that had marked the year. His words washed over Lucas like water over stones, meaningful in their tradition, but ultimately just noise compared to the feeling of Ellie's hand in his, warm and solid and real. He glanced down at his daughter and found her staring up at Clara with an expression of such pure contentment that it nearly broke him. This was what she'd needed, not just someone standing beside her, but someone who made her feel seen, valued, part of something larger than her grief. Clara had done that. In less than 2 days, this stranger had reached his child in ways he'd been failing to do for 3 years. The ceremony continued with individual families being called forward to receive the mayor's blessing and place their harvest offerings on the table, preserved goods, vegetables, grains, whatever they had to share with those in need. When the mayor called the McGraw family, Lucas felt his heart stutter. They walked forward together, still hand in hand, and Lucas was intensely aware of every eye on them. He set a jar of preserves on the table, the last batch Sarah had made before she died, saved for 3 years because he hadn't been able to bring himself to open it. But today felt like the right time to let it go, to give it to the community as Sarah would have wanted. Mayor Hutchins smiled down at them, and if he had questions about Clara's presence, he was too polite to voice them publicly. "The McGraw family," he intoned, placing his hand briefly on Lucas's shoulder, then Clara's, then Ellie's head. "May your winter be warm, your pantry full, and your home blessed with love and laughter." "Thank you, Mayor," Lucas managed, his voice strained. As they turned to walk back to their spot, Ellie suddenly pulled free from both their hands and ran to the mayor's table. Before anyone could stop her, she placed her cloth doll, Rose, her most precious possession, next to the jar of preserves. "For a little girl who doesn't have one," Ellie announced clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "So she won't be lonely like I was." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucas stood frozen, watching his daughter, his quiet, withdrawn daughter who barely spoke, make this declaration in front of the entire town. The past tense in her words echoed in his head. Like I was. Not like I am. Was. He looked at Clara and saw tears streaming silently down her face, her hand pressed to her mouth. Around them, he could hear people murmuring, could sense the emotional impact of what Ellie had just done, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat roughly. That's very generous, Miss Ellie. Very generous indeed." Ellie walked back to them, and when she reached for their hands again, both Lucas and Clara took them immediately, holding on perhaps tighter than necessary. They returned to their place in the crowd, and the ceremony continued, but Lucas barely heard any of it. His mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Ellie had given away Rose, the doll she'd clung to since Sarah's death, the one constant comfort in her small world. She'd given it away because she wasn't lonely anymore, because Clara had filled something in her that had been empty for so long, and tonight Clara would leave. The thought hit Lucas like a physical blow. What had he done? He'd brought Clara here to give Ellie one perfect day, but what he'd actually done was show his daughter what she was missing and then prepare to rip it away. He'd created a wound while trying to heal one. The ceremony concluded, and the crowd dispersed toward the tables laden with food. The communal meal was tradition, everyone bringing something to share, eating together as a community, strengthening the bonds that would carry them through winter. Usually, Lucas and Ellie would eat quickly and leave, uncomfortable in the forced sociability. But today, with Clara beside them, people kept approaching. Mrs. Henderson, the kindly widow who ran the boarding house, engaged Clara in conversation about the school. The Larson twins' mother asked Clara's advice on getting her boys to focus on their studies. Even Mrs. Patterson approached, though her smile was tight and her eyes calculating as she assessed Clara. "Miss Winslow, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Eleanor Patterson. I head the Ladies' Auxiliary and the Church Committee." She paused, waiting for Clara to be impressed. "I wasn't aware Mr. McGraw was courting anyone." Lucas opened his mouth to deflect, but Clara spoke first, her voice pleasant but carrying an edge of steel. "Mr. McGraw and I are friends, Mrs. Patterson. I'm Ellie's teacher, and when he mentioned she was nervous about attending the ceremony, I offered to accompany them. I hope that doesn't violate any of your committee's guidelines." The sweetness in Clara's tone couldn't quite hide the challenge underneath. Mrs. Patterson's smile grew even tighter. "Of course not. Though people will talk, you understand. A single woman staying at a widower's ranch, people will talk regardless of what anyone actually does, Mrs. Patterson," Clara interrupted smoothly. "I found that those most concerned with propriety are often those with the most to hide. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe Ellie wanted to show me the church garden." She took Ellie's hand and walked away, leaving Mrs. Patterson sputtering and Lucas fighting back an entirely inappropriate smile. Clara Winslow was a force of nature when challenged, and watching her defend their unconventional arrangement with such grace and fire did something strange to his heart. The afternoon wore on in a blur of conversations and careful navigation of social expectations. Lucas found himself watching Clara constantly, noticing the way she moved through the crowd with confidence despite being essentially an outsider, the way she deflected invasive questions while still remaining friendly, the way she never let go of Ellie's hand except when absolutely necessary. She was magnificent, and she was leaving in a few hours. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the square, Lucas felt his anxiety building. The ceremony was over. The meal was finished. There was no reason to stay longer. They should head home, let Clara collect her things, pay her the remaining money he owed, and watch her ride out of their lives. But Ellie was happy, laughing with some of the other children, and Clara was deep in conversation with the school board chairman about curriculum, and Lucas found himself desperately wanting to freeze time, to hold on to this moment where everything felt right, even though he knew it was built on borrowed hours. "Mr. McGraw?" A hand on his shoulder pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. He turned to find Reverend Williams standing beside him, his weathered face kind. "Might I have a word?" Lucas followed the Reverend to a quieter corner of the square, dread pooling in his stomach. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be comfortable. "That's quite a woman you've brought with you today," Reverend Williams began without preamble. "I've been watching the three of you, and I see something worth noting." "Reverend, I can explain. I'm not asking for explanations, son. I'm making an observation. That little girl of yours, the one who's barely spoken since her mother died, the one I've been praying over for 3 years, she's alive again, really alive. And Miss Winslow is the reason." Lucas swallowed hard. "It's temporary. She's just helping us for today." "Is she now?" The Reverend's eyes were shrewd. "That's a pity, because from where I stand, you've got the makings of a family if you're brave enough to reach for it." "You don't understand. We're not—" Lucas struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal the full truth of their arrangement. "She has her own life, her own obligations. Everyone has obligations. The question is whether you're willing to see past them to what might be possible." Reverend Williams squeezed his shoulder. "I've known you since you were younger than Ellie, Lucas. I married you and Sarah, baptized your daughter, buried your wife. I've watched you survive these past 3 years, but surviving isn't living. Today, for the first time since Sarah died, I saw you living. Think about that before you let it slip away." The Reverend walked away, leaving Lucas standing alone with thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. Living versus surviving, reaching for what might be possible, The words echoed in his head, dangerous and tempting. But it didn't matter what he wanted or what the Reverend thought he saw. He'd made a bargain with Clara. One day, $60, and then she'd walk away. She had her sick mother, her teaching position, her own life to rebuild. He couldn't ask her for more. He had no right. By the time they loaded back into the wagon for the journey home, twilight was painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Ellie was exhausted, her head drooping against Clara's shoulder. Clara held her carefully, stroking her hair with gentle fingers, and Lucas tried not to think about how natural they looked together, how right. The ranch appeared out of the gathering darkness like a haven, familiar and welcoming. Lucas carried Ellie inside while Clara followed, and together they got the half-asleep child into her nightgown and tucked into bed. "Did you have a good day, little bird?" Lucas asked softly, kneeling beside her bed. "The best day," Ellie murmured, her eyes already closing. "Mama would have liked Miss Clara. I think they would have been friends." The words pierced Lucas straight through. He couldn't speak, could only kiss his daughter's forehead and retreat from the room before she saw his tears. Clara was waiting in the hallway, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. They moved to the main room in silence, and Lucas busied himself building up the fire even though the night wasn't particularly cold. He needed something to do with his hands, needed to focus on something other than the fact that Clara would be packing her bag soon and riding away. "I should settle our account," Lucas said finally, pulling out the remaining money. $50 in coins and bills, the agreed-upon sum. He held it out to Clara, who stared at it as if it might bite her. "I don't want it," she said quietly. "What?" "The money. I don't want it." Clara met his eyes, and he saw confusion and determination warring in her expression. "Today wasn't... I didn't do this for money. I did it because Ellie needed it, because you asked, because..." She stopped, shaking her head. "Just keep it. Buy Ellie something nice. Fix the barn. I don't care. But I won't take payment for something that mattered." Lucas stood there holding the money, completely at a loss. "Clara, we had an agreement. Then consider me breaking it." She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "I should have left this afternoon, right after the ceremony. That was the deal. But I thought maybe we could have dinner together, one last meal. And now it's dark and I should go anyway, but Stay." The word erupted from Lucas before he could stop it. "Stay tonight. Leave in the morning when it's light and safe." Clara turned back to face him, and something passed between them in the firelight. All the things they'd been carefully not saying, all the feelings they'd been trying to ignore. The air felt charged, dangerous. "That's not what we agreed to," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know, but I'm asking anyway, please, for Ellie's sake. She'll want to say goodbye properly in the morning." It was a manipulation, using his daughter to convince Clara to stay longer, and they both knew it. But Clara nodded, and Lucas felt relief and dread in equal measure flood through him. They stood in the firelight, neither moving, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them over the past 2 days. This wasn't about a transaction anymore. This was about something far more dangerous. Connection, possibility, the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, life could offer second chances. But Clara still had her mother to care for, her teaching position in town, and Lucas still had a ranch to run, a daughter to raise, and grief that hadn't entirely released its hold on his heart. Wanting something and being able to have it were two entirely different things. "I'll make tea," Clara said finally, breaking the moment and moving toward the kitchen. Lucas let her go, sinking into the chair by the fire, and wondering how everything had gotten so complicated so quickly. 2 days ago this had seemed simple. Hire someone for a day, give Ellie a good memory, return to life as usual. But Clara Winslow had blown through his carefully constructed plans like wind through a house of cards. And now he was left with wreckage he didn't know how to clean up. He thought about what Reverend Williams had said about surviving versus living, about reaching for what might be possible, about being brave enough to want something more than just getting through each day. But bravery required hope, and hope was dangerous. Hope meant opening yourself up to loss, to disappointment, to all the ways life could hurt you. Lucas had learned that lesson when Sarah died. He'd sworn he wouldn't make himself that vulnerable again. Yet here he was, sitting in the firelight and trying not to think about Clara in his kitchen making tea, about Ellie sleeping peacefully down the hall, about how his house had felt alive for 2 brief days. Here he was, wanting things he had no right to want with a woman who'd promised to leave. Clara returned with 2 cups of tea and settled on the opposite end of the sofa. They drank in silence, both staring into the fire as if it held answers neither of them could find. "Tell me about Sarah," Clara said finally, her voice soft. "If you want to, I mean. You don't have to, but—" "She was everything good," Lucas interrupted, surprising himself. He rarely talked about Sarah, found it too painful to put into words. But tonight, with the firelight and Clara's quiet presence, the words came easier. Kind, gentle, always seeing the best in people. She loved growing things, the roses, the garden. Even me when I was just a rough ranch hand with more dreams than sense. She made everything beautiful just by being in it. She sounds wonderful. She was. And when she died, I felt like all the beauty died with her, like the world had turned gray and would never be bright again. Lucas stared into his tea. "I've been so focused on just surviving, on keeping Ellie fed and clothed and safe, that I forgot there was supposed to be more to life than that. And now," Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, "now I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Lucas looked up and met her eyes across the flickering firelight. "These past 2 days, you've reminded me what living looks like. You've brought light back into this house. You've made my daughter laugh again, and tomorrow morning you're going to leave. And I'm going to have to figure out how to go back to surviving when I've been reminded what it feels like to live." "Lucas," Clara started, but he held up his hand. "I'm not asking you for anything. I know the situation. I know you have responsibilities, that your life is in town. I'm just saying thank you for giving us these 2 days, for being more than we had any right to ask for." Clara set down her tea with shaking hands. "What if I don't want to leave?" The words hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying. Lucas felt his heart stop, then start again at double speed. "What? What if I don't want to leave?" Claire repeated, her voice stronger now. "What if these 2 days have meant something to me too? What if I look at you and Ellie and see something I didn't know I was looking for?" "Clara, you can't. My mother has a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson checks on her daily, and the doctor visits twice a week. She's stable, comfortable. She'd want me to be happy." Clara leaned forward, intensity in every line of her body. "I came here thinking this was a job, a transaction, but it's become something else, something real, and I—" Whatever she was about to say was cut off by a sound from Ellie's room. Both of them froze, listening. Then came the sound again, a whimper, then a cry. Lucas was on his feet instantly, rushing down the hall with Clara right behind him. They burst into Ellie's room to find her bed empty, the window open, cold night air rushing in. "Ellie!" Lucas's voice cracked with panic as he leaned out the window, scanning the darkness. "Ellie!" But his daughter was gone, vanished into the night, and with her went every thought except the primal terror of a parent whose child has disappeared into danger. Lucas's mind went blank with terror, every thought obliterated except the primal need to find his daughter. He vaulted through the window without thinking, landing hard in the dirt outside and immediately scanning the darkness. The moon was only a sliver, providing barely enough light to see shapes but not details. The night pressed in around him, full of shadows that could hide a small girl or conceal 100 dangers. "Ellie!" His voice ripped through the darkness, raw and desperate. "Ellie, where are you?" Behind him, he heard Clara climbing through the window more carefully, her dress catching on the frame. She landed beside him, slightly off balance, but recovered quickly. Which way would she go? Clara's voice was steady despite the fear Lucas could hear beneath it. Does she have a favorite place? Somewhere she feels safe? Lucas forced himself to think past the panic. Ellie was 4 years old, small, easily frightened. She wouldn't have gone far on purpose. Unless— The roses, he said suddenly. She was so excited about the roses coming back to life. Maybe she wanted to see them in the moonlight, or— But even as he said it, doubt crept in. The roses were on the other side of the house, and they'd checked there first thing. No sign of her. They ran around the house anyway, calling her name, checking behind every bush and around every corner. Nothing. The rose bushes stood skeletal and silent in the darkness, their newly pruned branches looking like reaching fingers. The barn, Lucas said, already running. She likes to visit the horses when she's upset. They burst into the barn, and Lucas grabbed a lantern, his hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to light it. The golden glow pushed back the darkness, illuminating the stalls where the horses shifted nervously, disturbed by the commotion. But there was no small figure hiding in the hay, no quiet sobbing from the tack room. "Ellie!" Clara called, her voice echoing off the wooden walls. "Sweetheart, if you can hear us, please answer. You're not in trouble. We just want to know you're safe." Silence answered them, broken only by the horses' restless movements and Lucas's ragged breathing. "The creek," Lucas said, a new wave of terror washing over him. "God, the creek. She likes to look for smooth stones there, but in the dark—" He couldn't finish the thought. The creek wasn't deep, but it was rocky, and if she'd fallen, if she'd hit her head— They ran across the yard and down the slope toward where the creek cut through his property, the lantern swinging wildly in Lucas's grip. The sound of water over rocks grew louder as they approached, and Lucas felt his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest. "Ellie! Ellie, please!" His voice broke on her name. They searched both banks, Lucas wading into the cold water without hesitation, holding the lantern high to illuminate every rock and pool. Clara searched the shoreline, lifting branches and checking behind boulders, but there was nothing. No sign of her anywhere. "How long has she been gone?" Clara asked, her voice tight with controlled panic. "How long were we in the main room?" "I don't know. 20 minutes? Half an hour?" Lucas climbed out of the creek, water streaming from his boots, his mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She could be anywhere by now. She could have wandered onto the road or gotten turned around in the dark, or— "Don't," Clara interrupted firmly, gripping his arm. "Don't think like that. She's smart, Lucas. You've raised a smart, capable girl. She wouldn't go far without reason." "But what reason could she have for leaving?" Lucas heard the desperation in his own voice. "She was happy today. She was fine when we put her to bed. Why would she run away?" Clara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was small and horrified. "Because I said I was leaving in the morning." Lucas turned to stare at her in the lamplight. "What?" "In the hallway, after we tucked her in. We were talking, and I said—" Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "I said I should have left this afternoon, right after the ceremony. That I should go anyway. Lucas, what if she heard us? What if she thought I was leaving right then? And she—" The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Ellie had heard them talking, had heard Clara say she should leave, had probably heard Lucas practically begging her to stay, and then what? Had she run away because she was scared of losing another mother, or had she gone looking for something? "The chapel," Clara said suddenly, her eyes wide. "Lucas, does Ellie know where her mother is buried?" "Of course, I take her there on—" He stopped, understanding dawning. "The rose garden, behind the old chapel. She said her mother's favorite flowers were roses, and you told her that roses could come back to life with the right care." "She's gone to find her mother," Clara whispered. "She's gone to see if the roses behind the chapel are still alive, thinking that maybe—" Lucas was already running before she finished the sentence. The old chapel was nearly a mile away, abandoned for years after the new church was built in town. But the cemetery behind it was still maintained. Sarah's grave was there, marked with a simple stone and surrounded by the wild roses that had seeded themselves from the bushes she'd planted years ago. Clara ran beside him, holding up her skirts, her breath coming in gasps. The lantern light bounced crazily as they ran, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on Lucas's eyes. Every movement in his peripheral vision made him think he'd spotted Ellie, only to find it was just branches moving in the wind or his own desperate imagination. The chapel appeared as a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, its steeple leaning precariously after years of neglect. Lucas had always meant to help organize a work party to stabilize it, but he'd never gotten around to it. Now, as they approached, he sent up a desperate prayer to whatever might be listening that the building wouldn't collapse on his daughter. "Ellie!" he called as they reached the chapel grounds. "Ellie, are you here?" They circled the building, and Lucas felt his hope beginning to fracture. What if he was wrong? What if she wasn't here at all, and they were wasting precious time while she wandered further into danger? Then Clara grabbed his arm, pointing toward the back of the chapel. There. Do you see? Lucas followed her finger and spotted it. A small patch of disturbed earth near the cemetery gate, and beyond it, barely visible in the lantern light, a tiny figure sitting among the wild roses. Ellie! The relief was so intense it nearly brought Lucas to his knees. He ran forward, Clara right behind him, and as they got closer, he could see his daughter more clearly. She was sitting cross-legged on the ground beside Sarah's grave, surrounded by the tangle of wild rose bushes. Her nightgown was torn and dirty, her feet bare and scratched from the walk. Tears streaked her face, making pale trails through the dirt. In her hands she clutched something, a small bundle of roses she'd picked, thorns and all, her palms bleeding from where they'd cut her. Ellie, Lucas said softly, not wanting to startle her. Little bird, we've been so worried. Ellie looked up at them, and the devastation in her young face was almost more than Lucas could bear. I wanted to bring Mama back, she sobbed. Miss Clara said roses could come back to life, that they just needed someone to care for them. I thought maybe if I came here and talked to Mama's roses, if I told them how much I missed her, maybe she would come back too. Lucas felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. He dropped to his knees beside his daughter, setting the lantern aside and pulling her into his arms, despite the thorns still clutched in her hands. She was cold, shaking, her small body racked with sobs. Oh, sweetheart, he murmured against her hair. Oh, my brave, beautiful girl, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you've been carrying this. Clara knelt beside them, and Lucas felt her hand on his back, offering comfort and support. When he looked up at her, he saw tears streaming down her face, her expression a mirror of his own anguish. Ellie, Clara said gently, reaching out to carefully take the roses from the child's bleeding hands. Can I explain something to you? Ellie nodded against Lucas's chest, her sobs subsiding into hiccups. When I said roses could come back to life, I meant the plant itself, the roots and branches that grow in the ground. But your mama, sweetheart, she's not like a rose. She's not waiting in the ground to bloom again. Clara's voice was thick with tears but steady. Your mama is somewhere much more beautiful now, somewhere without pain or sadness. And she lives on in other ways, in your papa's memories, in the stories he tells you, in the way you scrunch up your nose when you laugh just like she used to. But I want her here, Ellie whispered. I want a mama like the other children have. I know, Clara said softly, and I'm so sorry that she can't be here. It's not fair, and it's okay to be sad about that. It's okay to miss her. But you're leaving too, Ellie said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I heard you. You said you should go away, and then I won't have anyone. Lucas and Clara exchanged a look over Ellie's head, and in that moment, something silent passed between them. A decision, an understanding, a leap of faith into unknown territory. What if I didn't leave? Clara asked quietly. Ellie pulled back to look at her, hope warring with fear in her expression. You'd stay? If your papa wants me to. If you want me to. Clara looked at Lucas, her honey gold eyes searching his face. Not as a replacement for your mama, nobody could ever replace her, but as someone who cares about you very much and would be honored to be part of your family. Lucas couldn't speak around the lump in his throat. Everything he'd been trying not to feel, all the emotions he'd been carefully suppressing, rose up and threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't how he'd planned things. This wasn't the safe, controlled arrangement he'd created to protect his heart and his daughters. This was messy and complicated and terrifying. This was opening himself up to the possibility of loss again, of caring about someone who might leave or be taken away. This was choosing to live instead of just survive, and it scared him more than he wanted to admit. But as he looked at his daughter's tear-stained face, as he felt Clara's steady presence beside him, as he knelt in the dirt among wild roses beside his wife's grave, Lucas realized something profound. Sarah wasn't here anymore. She existed in his memories, in the color of Ellie's eyes, in the lessons she'd taught him about love and kindness. But she wasn't here, and he'd been so busy grieving her absence that he'd almost missed the gift standing right in front of him. Clara Winslow wasn't Sarah. She never would be. She was something entirely different, fierce where Sarah had been gentle, forthright where Sarah had been diplomatic, tempered by hardship in ways Sarah had never had to be. But she was also kind and brave and had somehow seen past his grief to the man he used to be, the man he might be again. Yes, Lucas said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, I want you to stay. We both do. Ellie threw herself at Clara, wrapping her small arms around the woman's neck with a force that nearly knocked her over. Clara caught her, holding tight, her face buried in Ellie's hair as she cried. Lucas wrapped his arms around both of them, and for a long moment they simply held each other in the darkness behind the old chapel, surrounded by wild roses and the memory of loss but choosing, finally, to reach for life. When they finally separated, Clara carefully examined Ellie's cut hands by the lantern light. "These need to be cleaned and bandaged," she said practically, though her voice still trembled. "And young lady, you are never, ever to leave the house alone at night again. Do you understand? You scared us half to death." "I'm sorry," Ellie whispered. "I just wanted—" "I know what you wanted," Clara said gently. "And I understand. But there are better ways to deal with those feelings than running off into the dark. When you're scared or sad or confused, you come to your papa or to me and we'll figure it out together. That's what families do." "Promise?" Ellie asked, her voice small. "Promise," Clara said firmly. Lucas lifted Ellie into his arms, and the three of them made their way back toward the ranch, moving more slowly now that the immediate crisis had passed. Ellie fell asleep against Lucas's shoulder halfway home, exhausted by emotion and the long walk. By the time they reached the house, dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Lucas carried Ellie to her room, but this time he closed the window firmly and latched it. Clara appeared with the medical kit, and together they cleaned and bandaged Ellie's scratched feet and cut hands, working in silent coordination like they'd been doing this together for years. When Ellie was settled back in bed, sleeping deeply, Lucas and Clara retreated to the kitchen. Neither of them spoke as Clara put the kettle on, and Lucas sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The terror of the past hour had drained something essential from him, leaving him hollow and shaking. Clara set a cup of tea in front of him, then surprised him by sitting beside him instead of across from him. She took his hand, and he gripped hers like a lifeline. "I meant what I said," Clara said quietly. "About staying, if you really want me to." "Are you sure?" Lucas turned to face her, needing to see the truth in her eyes. "Clara, this isn't— We barely know each other. 2 days ago, you were a stranger I hired for a transaction. This is crazy." "It is crazy," Clara agreed. "It's impulsive and probably foolish and definitely not what either of us planned. But Lucas, when I thought about leaving tomorrow, when I was actually preparing to walk away, all I could feel was this hollow ache, like I was about to make a terrible mistake." "What about your mother, your teaching position?" "I'll bring my mother here, if you'll have her. Mrs. Henderson can help arrange the transport. As for teaching—" Clara smiled slightly. "The schoolhouse is only 5 miles from here. I can ride there and back each day. Or we can hire someone to take my place if you need me here more. We'll figure it out." "Just like that?" Lucas couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You'd upend your whole life based on 2 days?" "Not based on 2 days," Clara corrected. "Based on what those 2 days showed me about what life could be. Lucas, I've been surviving too, just like you. Ever since the scandal in Philadelphia, ever since my father died, I've been going through the motions, keeping my head down, trying not to want anything, because wanting things had only brought me pain. But being here, with you and Ellie, it reminded me that there's more to life than just getting through each day." Lucas found himself echoing Reverend Williams' words. Surviving versus living. Exactly. Clara squeezed his hand. "I want to live, Lucas. And I want to live here, with you and Ellie, if you'll let me." "There are things you should know," Lucas said, needing to be honest even though it terrified him. "I loved Sarah. I'll always love her. There will be days when grief hits me out of nowhere, when I see something that reminds me of her and I'll struggle. I can't promise—" "I'm not asking you to forget her," Clara interrupted gently. "She was your wife, Ellie's mother. She'll always be part of this family. I'm not trying to erase her or replace her. I'm just asking for space beside that love, not instead of it." Lucas stared at her, this remarkable woman who seemed to understand things he barely understood himself. "Why would you want this? You could have a fresh start, meet someone without all this baggage." "Because I don't want someone without baggage," Clara said fiercely. "I want you, Lucas McGraw." I want your complicated grief and your fierce devotion to your daughter and the way you're trying so hard to do right by everyone, even when you're barely holding yourself together. I want the man who would pay a stranger $60 just to make his child happy for one day. I want the father who jumped through a window without hesitation when he thought his daughter was in danger. I want the rancher who keeps a garden alive, even though he's terrible at it, because it reminds him of his wife. Clara, Lucas's voice broke. I want you, she repeated, leaning closer, with all your broken pieces and jagged edges. And I'm hoping you might want me too, with all my damage and complications, and the scandal that's probably going to follow me here eventually. Lucas raised his free hand and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear he hadn't realized she'd shed. I want you, he said simply. God help me. I've wanted you since I watched you stand up to Henry Mackenzie in his store. I want you, and I'm terrified of wanting you, and I have no idea how to do this. Neither do I, Clara admitted. So we'll figure it out together. We'll make mistakes and have arguments and probably confuse poor Ellie sometimes. But we'll do it together. Lucas leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, breathing in the scent of lavender that clung to her skin. They stayed like that for a long moment, not kissing, just existing in each other's space, letting the reality of what they'd decided settle over them. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was fully up, painting the kitchen in golden light. It was a new day in every possible sense, full of uncertainty and promise in equal measure. I should go to town, Clara said practically. Talk to Mrs. Henderson about my mother, collect my things, maybe speak to the school board about the new arrangement. I'll come with you, Lucas said immediately. Clara smiled. Lucas, you have a ranch to run, and Ellie will need you when she wakes up. I can handle the logistics. Are you sure? He hated the idea of letting her out of his sight, irrational as that was. I'm sure. Besides, the sooner I go, the sooner I can come back. Clara stood, smoothing her wrinkled, dirty dress. Though I should probably make myself presentable first. I look like I've been wrestling bears. You look beautiful, Lucas said honestly, and was rewarded with a flush of color across her cheeks. She cleaned up as best she could, changed into her traveling dress, and within an hour was ready to ride. Lucas walked her to where her horse was saddled and waiting. You'll come back. He couldn't quite keep the uncertainty from his voice. Clara turned and took both his hands in hers. Lucas McGraw, I'm going to come back this evening with my mother, my belongings, and probably enough gossip from town to last us through winter. You're not getting rid of me that easily. Then she did something that surprised them both. She stood on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, chaste, nothing like the passionate embraces in the dime novels, but it rocked Lucas to his core. Her lips were soft and warm, and when she pulled back, her honey gold eyes were bright with promise. That's a down payment, she said with a small smile, on all the tomorrows we're going to have. Then she mounted her horse and rode away, and Lucas stood in the yard watching her until she disappeared over the hill. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. In the span of a few hours, he'd gone from thinking Clara would leave forever to planning a life with her. It was insane. It was impulsive. It was the first thing that had felt right since Sarah died. He walked back to the house and found Ellie awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her bandaged hands folded in front of her. Where's Miss Clara? She asked immediately, fear flickering in her eyes. She went to town to get her things, Lucas explained, sitting beside his daughter. She's coming back tonight, little bird. She's coming back to stay. Forever? Ellie's voice was barely a whisper. Lucas thought about the promises he'd made, about the future that suddenly seemed possible instead of just inevitable. Nothing's forever, Ellie. Life doesn't work that way. But for as long as we can make it work, for as long as we choose each other every day, yes, she's staying. Ellie processed this with her usual seriousness. I'm sorry I ran away. I'm sorry I scared you. I know, sweetheart, and I'm sorry that you felt you had to. I should have... Lucas stopped, unsure how to explain his own confusion and fear to a 4-year-old. I should have been clear about things. Should have made sure you felt safe. Will Miss Clara really be my mama now? Not your mama, Lucas corrected gently. You only have one mama, and she's watching over you from heaven. But Clara wants to be part of our family. She wants to take care of you and love you and be here for you. Is that okay? Ellie nodded slowly, then threw her arms around Lucas's neck. I'm glad, Papa. The house feels warmer when she's here. Lucas held his daughter close, blinking back tears. The house did feel warmer. He felt warmer, like something frozen inside him was finally beginning to thaw. They spent the day doing ordinary things, feeding animals, mucking stalls, repairing a section of fence that had been sagging for weeks. Lucas found himself working with more energy than he'd had in years, as if Clara's promise to return had injected purpose back into his daily routines. As evening approached, he and Ellie watched the road, both of them too anxious to stay inside. When Lucas finally spotted movement on the horizon, not one but two figures on horseback, with what looked like a loaded wagon following behind, his heart leaped. Clara was coming back. She'd actually done it. She'd gone to town and made arrangements and was returning, bringing her life with her to merge with his. As the party drew closer, Lucas could make out details. Clara rode in front, with an older woman beside her who must be her mother, gray-haired and frail-looking but sitting her horse with dignity. Behind them, Mrs. Henderson drove the wagon, which was loaded with trunks and furniture. They pulled into the yard just as the sun touched the western mountains, painting everything in warm amber light. Lucas helped Clara's mother dismount, introducing himself and Ellie, while Clara and Mrs. Henderson began unloading. Clara's mother, Margaret, was kind-eyed despite her obvious illness, and she looked at Lucas with frank assessment. "So you're the man who's convinced my daughter to take another chance on happiness," she said, her voice weak but warm. "I hope you know what a gift that is, Mr. McGraw. Clara doesn't trust easily." "I'm beginning to understand that, ma'am," Lucas replied, "and I promise I'll do everything I can to prove myself worthy of that trust." Margaret smiled. "See that you do. Now, I believe my daughter mentioned something about a guest room?" Lucas showed Margaret to the room Clara had stayed in, making sure she was comfortable before returning to help with the unloading. It took the better part of an hour to bring everything inside, and by the time they finished, the house looked different, more lived in, more like a home where multiple people existed rather than a place where two people marked time. Mrs. Henderson departed with promises to check in next week, and suddenly it was just the four of them, Lucas, Clara, Ellie, and Margaret, standing in the main room surrounded by the detritus of rapid relocation. "Well," Clara said, looking around with her hands on her hips, "I suppose we should figure out the sleeping arrangements." "You can have my old room," Lucas said quickly. "I'll move my things to—" He stopped, unsure where exactly he would move to. "The main bedroom is large enough for two, isn't it?" Margaret's voice drifted from her room, where she'd apparently been listening. "If you're planning to make this a real arrangement, you might as well start as you mean to go on." Lucas and Clara both flushed, neither quite meeting the other's eyes. "Mother!" Clara hissed, mortified. "What? I may be ill, but I'm not dead yet, and I'm certainly not blind." Margaret appeared in her doorway, leaning against the frame. "You two have feelings for each other. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. Now, I'm not saying you need to rush into anything, but let's be practical about space and propriety and all those other considerations." "Mrs. Winslow," Lucas started. "Margaret," she corrected. "We're going to be family after all. Might as well use first names." Family. The word hung in the air, strange and wonderful and terrifying. Lucas looked at Clara and saw his own mixture of fear and hope reflected in her face. "One step at a time," Clara said firmly. "Let's figure out the immediate logistics before we worry about anything else." They spent the rest of the evening organizing, with Ellie helping by mostly getting underfoot, but keeping everyone entertained with her chatter. By the time they sat down to a late dinner of soup and bread, the house had been transformed. Claire's belongings were integrated with theirs, Margaret was settled comfortably, and there was a sense of organized chaos that felt somehow exactly right. After dinner, as Ellie began to nod off at the table, Clara suggested a new routine. "What if we all say one thing we're grateful for before bed? It could be our tradition." Ellie perked up. "I'm grateful Miss Clara came back." "I'm grateful for brave little girls who remind me what's important," Margaret said with a gentle smile. Clara looked at Lucas, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "I'm grateful for second chances." Lucas swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm grateful for all of you, for this moment, for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, we can be happy again." As he carried Ellie to bed and Clara followed to help tuck her in, As Margaret called a soft goodnight from her room, Lucas felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Real, solid hope that wasn't based on denial or desperation, but on the concrete reality of people who'd chosen to come together despite all the reasons they probably shouldn't. Later, after Ellie was asleep and Margaret had retired, Lucas and Clara stood together on the porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of winter. "Are you scared?" Clara asked quietly. "Terrified," Lucas admitted. "You?" "Absolutely." Clara leaned against him and Lucas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "But I think that's okay. I think being scared means we're actually living instead of just surviving." "When did you get so wise?" "Probably around the same time I decided to accept a bizarre job offer from a desperate rancher," Clara said with a soft laugh. "Best decision I ever made." They stood there in comfortable silence, two damaged people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, choosing to build something new from the broken pieces of their pasts. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges ahead, gossip from town, the complicated dance of blending lives and histories, the ever-present shadow of grief that would sometimes make itself known. But as Lucas held Clara close and listened to the quiet sounds of his house, Ellie's soft breathing, Margaret's occasional cough, the settling of wood and stone, he knew with certainty that this was right. This strange, imperfect, complicated family they were creating was exactly what they all needed. One day had turned into forever, and Lucas McGraw, who'd thought his heart was buried with his wife, discovered it was actually just waiting for the right person to come along and remind him how to use it again. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery, each day bringing new challenges and small victories as they learned to navigate life as a makeshift family. The house that had been silent for so long now rang with voices, Margaret's gentle humming from her room as she worked on mending, Ellie's laughter as Clara taught her letters at the kitchen table. The easy conversation that flowed between Lucas and Clara as they worked side by side preparing meals or tending to evening chores. But it wasn't seamless. Nothing worth having ever was. The first real difficulty came on a Sunday morning when Lucas suggested they attend church services in town. Clara had gone rigid at the breakfast table, her knuckles white around her coffee cup. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said carefully, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Why not?" Ellie asked innocently. "Papa says everyone goes to church on Sunday." Clara set down her cup with deliberate precision. "Because, sweetheart, not everyone in town is going to be happy that I'm living here. There will be talk, and some of it won't be kind." "Let them talk," Lucas said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. "We haven't done anything wrong." "Haven't we?" Claire's voice was sharp with an edge Lucas hadn't heard before. "An unmarried woman living under your roof? Lucas, you might not care about your reputation, but I've already lost one position because of scandal. I won't let my presence here damage you or Ellie." Margaret spoke up from her seat by the window, where she was watching the morning sun paint the mountains gold. "Then perhaps you should stop being unmarried." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucas felt his heart stutter, and Clara's face went pale, then flushed bright red. "Mother!" Clara's voice was strangled. "I'm simply being practical, dear. You two clearly have feelings for each other. You're already living as a family. Why not make it official?" Margaret turned to face them, her expression serene despite the bomb she'd just dropped. "Unless you have objections, Mr. McGraw?" Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it again. Objections? His mind was spinning too fast to form coherent thoughts. Marriage. To Clara. He'd been married before, had loved Sarah with everything he had. Could he do that again? Should he? But even as doubt flickered through him, another part of his mind, the part that had been cataloging Clara's presence in his life over the past weeks, was already providing answers. The way she moved through his kitchen as if she belonged there, the sound of her reading to Ellie before bed, the comfortable silences they shared while working, the way his heart lifted every time he heard her voice. This wasn't the same as what he'd had with Sarah. It couldn't be. But maybe that was okay. Maybe love didn't have to look the same way twice to be real. "Lucas?" Claire's voice was soft, uncertain. "You don't have to answer that. Mother is being presumptuous." No, Lucas interrupted, his voice rough. She's being practical, and she's right. Clara's eyes widened. What? Lucas stood, suddenly needing to move, to think while his body was in motion. He paced to the window, stared out at his land, the corrals, the barn, the mountains beyond. Everything looked the same as it always had, but everything felt different. I loved Sarah, he said quietly. I'll always love her, but she's gone, and I'm still here, and Ellie's still here, and you... He turned to face Clara. You walked into our lives and reminded us how to live again. You've been more of a mother to Ellie in 3 weeks than I ever could be. You've made this house feel like a home instead of a mausoleum, and I... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Clara had risen from her seat and was walking toward him, her honey gold eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent. You what? She asked softly. I care about you, Lucas said, the words feeling inadequate for what he actually felt. More than I thought I could care about anyone again. I don't know if it's love yet. I don't know if I even know what love looks like anymore after everything, but I know I don't want you to leave. I know I wake up in the morning and the first thing I think about is whether you're already up making coffee. I know that when Ellie laughs at something you've said, I feel like the sun's come out after a storm. Claire's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Lucas, I'm not asking you to marry me right now, Lucas continued quickly before he lost his nerve. That would be crazy. We barely know each other. But Margaret's right that living like this is going to cause problems. So what if we got married for practical reasons? For propriety, for Ellie, to stop the gossip before it starts. And then we could, I don't know, figure out the rest as we go? A marriage of convenience? Claire's voice was hard to read. Is that terrible? Lucas felt his heart sinking. Of course it was terrible. What woman wanted to be proposed to out of practicality? But Clara surprised him by laughing, a short, sharp sound that held both humor and something like disbelief. Lucas McGraw, you are possibly the most unromantic man I've ever met. A marriage of convenience, as if the past 3 weeks haven't already shown us that there's nothing convenient about any of this. Then what would you call it? Clara stepped closer, near enough that Lucas could see the flecks of darker gold in her eyes, could smell the lavender soap she used. I'd call it a marriage of possibility. We're both damaged people who've been given an unexpected second chance. We care about each other. Maybe not love yet, but something that could become love if we're brave enough to let it. And yes, there are practical considerations. But Lucas, if I marry you, it won't be just for propriety or Ellie or to stop gossip. Then why? Lucas hardly dared to ask. Because I want to, Clara said simply. Because when I think about my future now, I can't picture it without you and Ellie in it. Because you make me feel safe and valued in ways I didn't know I needed. Because maybe, just maybe, we can build something real out of all our broken pieces. Lucas reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused rancher's hands that suddenly felt too rough for something this delicate. Are you sure? Clara, once people know about your past, about Philadelphia, let them know, Clara said fiercely. I was accused of impropriety by a man who couldn't take rejection. I did nothing wrong, but I've been carrying the shame of it anyway. If marrying you means facing that gossip head on, then so be it. I'm tired of running from the past. I want to build a future instead. From across the room, Ellie's small voice piped up. Does this mean Miss Clara is going to be my mama for real? Lucas had almost forgotten his daughter was there. So focused had he been on Clara. He turned to find Ellie watching them with cautious hope, Margaret beside her with a knowing smile. Would you like that, little bird? Lucas asked. Ellie nodded so vigorously her braids bounced. Yes! Then we could be a real family like the others at church. Clara knelt down so she was eye level with Ellie. Sweetheart, I want to make sure you understand something. If your papa and I get married, I'll be your mama in all the ways that matter. I'll take care of you and love you and be here for you. But your first mama, the one who gave birth to you, she'll always be your mama too. I'm not trying to replace her. I know, Ellie said seriously. Grandma Margaret explained it to me. She said people can have more than one person who loves them like a mama does, and that doesn't make the first one less special. Lucas looked at Margaret with gratitude. The older woman had been a quiet presence in their household, often sitting back and observing, but clearly she'd been having important conversations with Ellie that he hadn't even thought to initiate. "Then yes," Clara said, pulling Ellie into a hug. "If your papa asks me properly, I'll marry him, and we'll be a family." "I believe that's your cue, Mr. McGraw," Margaret said with amusement. Lucas felt heat creep up his neck. He'd already basically proposed, hadn't he? But looking at Clara's expectant face, at Ellie's excited expression, he realized they were right. If he was going to do this, he should do it properly. He had no ring, no fancy words prepared, but he did have a heart that was slowly learning to hope again, and hands willing to work for the people he cared about, and a fierce determination to protect this fragile, unlikely family they were building. Lucas dropped to one knee right there in the kitchen, taking Clara's hand in his. Her fingers trembled slightly, and he gave them a gentle squeeze. "Clara Winslow, will you marry me? Not because it's convenient, not just because of Ellie or your mother or what the town thinks. Will you marry me because I think we could be happy together? Because I want to wake up every morning and see you making coffee? Because I want to learn who you are beneath all the armor you wear and let you learn who I am beneath all my grief? Because I think maybe, if we're brave enough and patient enough, we could build something neither of us expected, but both of us need?" Clara's tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Lucas McGraw. I'll marry you and take a chance on us." Ellie cheered, and Margaret applauded softly, and Lucas stood and pulled Clara into his arms. They held each other while Ellie danced around them, and Margaret watched with satisfaction. And for the first time since Sarah died, Lucas felt like the future held promise instead of just obligation. "When?" Clara asked against his shoulder. "As soon as possible," Lucas replied, "before either of us has time to panic and change our minds." Clara laughed, the sound slightly watery but genuine. "Fair enough. Next Sunday?" "Next Sunday," Lucas agreed, even though his heart was racing at the speed of what they were planning. The week that followed was organized chaos. Clara rode into town to speak with Reverend Williams about performing the ceremony, while Lucas worked double time to get the ranch in order. Margaret took charge of the practical arrangements with surprising energy for someone so ill, writing lists and directing activities from her chair by the window. The response from town was mixed, as they'd anticipated. Some people were genuinely happy for them. Mrs. Henderson promised to bake a cake, and several of Lucas's neighboring ranchers offered congratulations. But the gossip was fierce, particularly from Mrs. Patterson and her contingent, who seemed personally offended by the speed of the courtship. "They're saying you hired her," Clara reported after one trip to town, her face tight with suppressed anger. "That this whole thing started as some kind of transaction." Lucas felt his jaw clench. "We'll tell them the truth." "Which is?" Clara looked at him challengingly. "That I did hire you for one day. That it was supposed to be temporary, and that somewhere between pretending and real, we stopped being able to tell the difference." Lucas took her hands. "That's not shameful, Clara. That's honest. People will use it against us." "Let them try," Lucas said firmly. "We know the truth. Our family knows the truth. That's what matters." The Sunday of their wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost coating the grass and their breath visible in the early morning air. Lucas dressed in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to marry Sarah, and he had a moment of guilt about that before Margaret gently reminded him that Sarah would want him to be happy, would want him to live. Clara wore a dress that Margaret had helped her alter, a soft cream color that brought out the gold in her eyes. She'd pinned her hair up with wildflowers that Ellie had picked, and when Lucas saw her standing in the doorway ready to leave for town, his breath caught. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Clara smiled, though he could see the nervousness in the set of her shoulders. "I'm terrified." "Me too," Lucas admitted. "Want to run away?" "Absolutely," Clara said, "but I'm going to marry you anyway." They made the journey to town as a family. Lucas, Clara, Ellie, and Margaret in the wagon, moving slowly to accommodate Margaret's health. As they approached the church, Lucas could see that a small crowd had gathered despite the cold. Some were there out of genuine goodwill, but others, he suspected, were there out of curiosity or to witness what they expected to be a scandal. Reverend Williams met them at the church door, his weathered face kind. "Are you ready?" he asked Lucas quietly. "No," Lucas admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The Reverend smiled. "That's often how the best decisions are made." They entered the church, and Lucas was surprised to see it was nearly full. Apparently news of the wedding had spread, and the entire town had turned out. He recognized most of the faces, some friendly, some neutral, some openly disapproving, Mrs. Patterson sat in the third row with her mouth pressed into a thin line of judgment. But Lucas also saw the Larsons smiling encouragingly, Mrs. Henderson dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and several of his fellow ranchers nodding their approval. Whatever happened after today, at least some of the community was on their side. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. Reverend Williams spoke about second chances and the courage it takes to love again after loss. Lucas and Clara stood before him, hands clasped, and repeated vows that felt both traditional and entirely unique to their situation. "I, Lucas McGraw, take you, Clara Winslow, to be my wife. I promise to honor you, to work beside you, to give you space to heal and grow. I promise to be patient as we learn who we are together and to never stop choosing you even when it's hard." Clara's voice was steady as she responded. "I, Clara Winslow, take you, Lucas McGraw, to be my husband. I promise to love your daughter as my own, to respect the wife you lost, to build a home with you that honors both our pasts and our future. I promise to be brave enough to let you see all of me, the broken parts and the healing parts, and to trust you with my heart, even though it scares me." When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was chaste but meaningful, a promise sealed, a choice made, a future begun. Ellie cheered from where she sat with Margaret, and scattered applause rippled through the congregation. As they turned to face the community as husband and wife, Lucas saw Mrs. Patterson rise to her feet, his stomach clenched, waiting for her to say something cutting, to voice the objections she'd no doubt been storing up. But instead, she simply gathered her things and walked out of the church, several of her companions following. It was a statement, clear as words. She didn't approve, wouldn't condone this union, and wanted everyone to know it. "Let them go," Clara whispered, squeezing his hand. "We don't need their blessing." Lucas looked down at his new wife and realized she was right. They'd built this marriage on honesty and hope, and those who couldn't see the value in that didn't deserve space in their lives. The rest of the congregation came forward to offer congratulations, and for the most part, the sentiments were genuine. Mrs. Henderson hugged Clara with real warmth. Several of the mothers whose children Clara taught expressed their approval, and Lucas's neighboring ranchers clapped him on the back with knowing grins. But it was Reverend Williams' words as they prepared to leave that stuck with Lucas. "You've done a brave thing today," the older man said quietly. "Both of you, choosing to love again after loss, choosing to build a family from broken pieces, that takes more courage than most people have. There will be difficult days ahead, but I believe you have what it takes to weather them." The celebration that followed was small but heartfelt. They returned to the ranch where Mrs. Henderson had somehow managed to transport the promised cake, and several neighbors had dropped off food. They ate and laughed, and for a few hours the uncertainty of the future faded into the simple joy of the present. As evening approached and the guests departed, Lucas found himself alone with Clara on the porch, while Margaret put an exhausted Ellie to bed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled of autumn and wood smoke and possibility. "So," Clara said softly, "we're married." "We are," Lucas agreed, still trying to wrap his mind around how much his life had changed in less than a month. "Are you sorry?" Lucas turned to look at his wife. His wife, that would take getting used to, and saw genuine worry in her eyes. She was scared, he realized. Scared that he'd wake up and regret this impulsive decision. Scared that she couldn't measure up to Sarah's memory. Scared that she'd made another mistake that would cost her everything. "Come here," he said gently, opening his arms. Clara stepped into his embrace, and Lucas held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I'm not sorry. I'm terrified and uncertain and pretty sure I'm going to mess this up in a dozen ways, but I'm not sorry." "I'm terrified too," Clara admitted. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong." "What if nothing goes wrong?" Lucas pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "What if we actually make this work?" Clara smiled, small and tentative, but real. "That might be the most terrifying possibility of all." They stood there as the sun set. Two people who'd been broken by life, but were choosing to piece themselves back together, not alone, but together. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that stories promised. It was better, messier, more complicated, infinitely more real. The first few weeks of married life brought adjustments neither of them had fully anticipated. Lucas had grown used to sleeping alone, and suddenly sharing a bed with another person felt strange and intimate and occasionally awkward. They navigated the space between them with careful courtesy at first, staying on their respective sides, maintaining distance, both of them clearly unsure how to bridge the gap between married in name and married in practice. But gradually, night by night, the distance shrank. Lucas would wake to find Clara's hand had drifted to rest against his arm. Clara would stir in her sleep and unconsciously move closer to his warmth. Neither of them spoke about it, but the slow erosion of space between them felt significant, like their bodies were figuring out what their minds were still cautious about. The real turning point came 3 weeks after the wedding, on a night when Clara woke from a nightmare, gasping and disoriented. Lucas, trained by years of being alert to Ellie's night terrors, was instantly awake. "Clara? What's wrong?" She was sitting up, her breath coming in short gasps, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. It was just a dream." "About Philadelphia?" Lucas asked gently, remembering the scandal she'd mentioned but never elaborated on. Clara nodded, drawing her knees to her chest, suddenly looking young and vulnerable. "His name was Frederick Thornton. He was the son of the family I worked for as a governess. He took my refusal of his advances as a challenge rather than an answer. When he tried to force himself on me and I fought back, he told everyone that I'd been seducing him, trying to trap him into marriage. His family believed him. Society believed him. I lost my position, my reputation, everything." Lucas felt rage kindle in his chest, not at Clara, but at the man who'd hurt her and the society that had blamed her for it. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "It's not your burden to carry," Clara said quietly. Sometimes I dream about it, about being trapped, about screaming and no one believing me." Without thinking, Lucas reached out and pulled her into his arms. She stiffened for a moment, then melted against him, her face buried in his shoulder. He held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort. "You're safe here," he said finally. "I know that doesn't erase what happened. I know you'll carry those scars. But Clara, I see you. I believe you. And I will never let anyone hurt you like that again." Clara pulled back enough to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed but searching. "You really mean that?" "I really do." She kissed him then, not the chaste kiss they'd shared at their wedding, but something deeper, more desperate, full of need and trust, and the beginning of something that might be love. Lucas kissed her back, careful but genuine, and when they finally broke apart, something fundamental had shifted between them. They didn't make love that night. Both of them knew they weren't quite there yet, but they fell asleep in each other's arms, and when Lucas woke in the morning with Clara curled against his side, it felt right in a way nothing had felt right since Sarah died. The changing seasons brought their own challenges and gifts. Winter arrived in earnest, blanketing the ranch in snow and forcing them into closer quarters. The house that had felt empty for so long now felt almost crowded with 4 people living in it, but the warmth of that crowding was a gift Lucas hadn't known he'd been missing. Clara settled into life as a rancher's wife with surprising adaptability. She'd grown up privileged but had learned hard work during her years of reduced circumstances, and she brought that same determination to running the household. She and Lucas developed routines. He'd rise early to tend the animals while she got the fire going and breakfast started. They'd work together on daily chores. She'd teach Ellie in the afternoons while he handled ranch business, and evenings were for being together as a family. Margaret's health declined slowly but steadily, a sadness they all felt but accepted with as much grace as they could muster. She spent most days in her chair by the window, but she remained the heart of their household in many ways, offering wisdom and humor and unfailing support for the family Clara and Lucas were building. It was Margaret who noticed first that something was changing between Lucas and Clara beyond the practical partnership they'd started with. "You're in love with her," she said to Lucas one afternoon when Clara and Ellie had gone to check on the horses. It wasn't a question. Lucas, who'd been checking the firewood supply, startled at the declaration. "What?" "Don't play dumb, Lucas. It doesn't suit you." Margaret smiled gently. "I've been watching you watch her for weeks now. The way your face softens when she laughs. The way you touch the small of her back when you pass her in the kitchen. The way you wake up smiling now instead of with that haunted look you wore for the first month after the wedding." Lucas sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's looking, which, I suspect, does not include my daughter, who's convinced this is still primarily a marriage of convenience with friendship benefits." Margaret's eyes were knowing. "You should tell her." "Tell her what?" "That somewhere between getting married for practical reasons and learning to live together, I fell in love with her?" Lucas shook his head. "What if she doesn't feel the same way? What if I ruin what we've built by wanting more? What if she does feel the same way and you're both dancing around it because you're too scared to be vulnerable?" Margaret countered. "Lucas, I'm dying. We all know it, even if we don't say it out loud. I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. And the one thing I want before I go is to know that my daughter is truly happy, not just comfortable. Tell her how you feel. Take the risk. Life's too short to live in the safety of maybe." Margaret's words haunted Lucas for days. He'd catch himself watching Clara, really watching her, and seeing things he'd been trying not to acknowledge. The way she hummed while she worked. The unconscious grace of her movements. The fierce protectiveness she showed toward Ellie. The gentle patience she demonstrated with Margaret. The way she'd started leaving her hand in his a few beats longer than necessary when they said goodnight. The way his heart had started doing complicated things in his chest whenever she smiled at him. He was in love with her. Fully, completely, terrifyingly in love. Not the same way he'd loved Sarah. That love had been built over years, comfortable and familiar. This love was newer, sharper, born of crisis and choice, and the daily decision to keep choosing each other. It felt more fragile because of how quickly it had grown, but also stronger because it had been tested from the very beginning. But did Clara feel the same way? The question was answered on a bitter cold January night when a winter storm blew in with such ferocity that Lucas had to string a rope between the house and the barn to avoid getting lost in the whiteout conditions. He'd gone out to check on the animals one last time before bed, and when he returned, covered in snow and shivering despite his heavy coat, he found Clara waiting by the door with blankets and hot coffee. "I was worried," she said, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "You were gone so long." "Everything's secure," Lucas assured her, his teeth chattering. "Animals are fine. We're ready to wait out the storm." Clara led him to the fire and made him sit while she pulled off his wet boots and coat. Her hands were gentle but efficient, and Lucas found himself mesmerized by her profile in the firelight. The curve of her cheek, the concentration in her eyes, the small furrow between her brows that appeared when she was focused. "Clara," he said softly. She looked up, and whatever she saw in his face made her hands still. "Yes?" "I love you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and terrifying. Clara's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "I know that's not what we agreed to," Lucas continued quickly. "I know we said this was practical, that we'd figure things out as we went. But Clara, I figured it out. Somewhere between hiring you for one day and waking up married to you and learning how you take your coffee and watching you teach our daughter, I fell in love with you. And I need you to know that, even if you don't feel the same way, even if it makes things awkward. I need you to know that this isn't just practical for me anymore. You're not just my wife on paper. You're the person I want to come home to, the person I want to tell about my day, the person whose happiness matters more to me than my own." Clara was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. Lucas's heart sank, certain he'd ruined everything. But then she was moving, closing the distance between them and cupping his face in her hands. "You impossible man," she whispered. "I've been in love with you since you stood in the kitchen and asked me to stay without any expectation that I would. Since you jumped through a window to find Ellie. Since you held me while I cried about my past and never once made me feel like I was broken. I've been in love with you and terrified to say it because I thought you were still in love with Sarah, that I was just a convenient replacement. You're not a replacement, Lucas said fiercely. You could never be a replacement. You're entirely yourself, prickly and brave and so damn strong it takes my breath away. I love Sarah. I'll always love her. But Clara, I love you too, and it doesn't diminish what I had with her. It's just different, new, ours. Clara kissed him then, and this kiss was different from any they'd shared before. This was a kiss between two people who'd admitted what they felt, who'd chosen to be vulnerable, who'd taken the terrifying leap into love. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. "Take me to bed," Clara whispered. "Not because we're married, and it's expected, but because I love you, and I want you, and I'm tired of sleeping next to you and not being able to touch you the way I want to." Lucas stood, pulling her with him, and they went to their bedroom. What happened there was tender and awkward and occasionally clumsy, two people learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure, laughing at mishaps and marveling at the intimacy of it all. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and when they finally lay tangled together afterward, both glowing with satisfaction and emotion, Lucas felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. "I love you," he said again, because now that he'd said it once, he couldn't seem to stop. "I love you too," Clara replied, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "Lucas, I want this to work. Not just the practical parts, but all of it. I want us to be really married, really together." "We are together." "I mean," Clara propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I want us to have our own children someday, if you want that. I want to grow old with you. I want to build a life that's ours, not just something we fell into out of necessity." Lucas pulled her back down against him, his heart full to bursting. "I want all of that, every bit of it." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when Lucas woke in the morning with Clara in his arms and sunlight streaming through the window onto fresh snow, he felt a peace he hadn't known he was capable of feeling again. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Margaret's health continued to decline, and they all struggled with the knowledge that they were losing her. Clara threw herself into caring for her mother with fierce dedication, and Lucas supported her through the long nights and difficult days. When Margaret finally passed in early March, on a morning when the first crocuses were pushing through the last patches of snow, it was both a relief and a devastating loss. She died peacefully in her sleep with Clara holding her hand, and her last words had been, "Be happy, my girl. You've earned it." They buried her next to Sarah in the cemetery behind the old chapel, and Lucas found it fitting somehow. The two women who'd made their strange, beautiful family possible, resting side by side in the earth. Clara wept through the entire service, and Lucas held her while Ellie tucked wildflowers onto both graves, her small face solemn. "Goodbye, Grandma Margaret," Ellie said softly. "Goodbye, Mama Sarah. Thank you for sharing Papa with us." The innocence of it, the acceptance, broke something open in both Lucas and Clara. They clung to each other and their daughter, finding comfort in the family they'd built, in the love that had grown where none of them had expected it. Spring arrived properly after Margaret's death, bringing new life to the ranch. The roses Clara and Ellie had pruned the previous fall came back with astonishing vigor, pushing out new green growth and eventually, gloriously, blooming. Clara wept the first time she saw the flowers, pink and white and yellow. And Lucas understood that she was crying for more than just roses. She was crying for all the things that had seemed dead, but had found a way to live again. In late April, Clara came to Lucas with news that made his heart soar. She was pregnant. They'd hoped, but hadn't dared to expect, and now it was real. A baby, their baby, who would be born sometime in early winter. Ellie was beside herself with excitement at the prospect of a baby brother or sister, and she took her role as big sister seriously from that moment forward, talking to Clara's still flat stomach and promising to teach the baby everything she knew. The town's opinion of their marriage had gradually shifted from scandal to acceptance. Clara had won over even some of her harshest critics through her dedication to teaching and her genuine kindness to everyone she encountered. Mrs. Patterson still sniffed disapprovingly whenever she saw them, but even she couldn't deny that the McGraw family seemed genuinely happy. On a warm June evening, as Lucas and Clara sat on the porch watching Ellie play in the yard, Clara turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you remember that first day in the general store? When you asked me to be your date for one day, Lucas smiled, taking her hand and lacing their fingers together. How could I forget? It was the craziest thing I'd ever done. It was, Clara agreed, and I was so angry at first. Angry at you for putting me in that position. Angry at myself for needing the money badly enough to say yes. I thought it would be the easiest $60 I'd ever earn, pretend for a few hours, collect my payment, move on with my life. But, Lucas prompted when she fell silent, but then I met Ellie, and you, and I realized that some things that start as pretend have a way of becoming the most real parts of your life. Clara turned to face him fully. Lucas, I've been thinking about that money you tried to pay me, the $60. You never took it, Lucas said, remembering. I still have it in the top drawer of my desk. I want you to use it to buy something, Clara said. A headstone for Margaret's grave, something beautiful with roses carved on it. I want her to have something permanent, something that shows she mattered. Lucas felt his throat tighten. That's a beautiful idea. And Lucas, thank you. Thank for what? For being desperate enough to ask a stranger for one impossible day. For seeing past my armor to who I actually was. For giving me a family when I thought I'd never have one again. Clara's hand moved to rest on her still flat stomach. For giving me a life I didn't know I wanted. Lucas leaned in and kissed her, soft and sweet, tasting the salt of tears on her lips. Whether his or hers, he couldn't tell. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You took a chance on a broken man and his grieving daughter. You brought light back into a house that had been dark for too long. You taught me that hearts can hold more than one love, that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the past. They sat like that as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, while Ellie's laughter rang out across the yard. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanged, bearing witness to all the ways life could break you and heal you in equal measure. One day had turned into forever, but not in any way either of them could have predicted. The transaction that started in desperation had transformed into a love story built on honesty, courage, and the willingness to risk being hurt for the chance at being happy. As summer gave way to autumn and Clara's pregnancy became visible, the ranch took on a quality of anticipation. They were preparing not just for a new baby, but for all the tomorrows that baby represented. The continuation of a family that had been cobbled together from broken pieces, but had become something beautiful in the process. In November, on a night when the first snow was falling softly outside, Clara gave birth to a son. They named him James, after Lucas's father, with the middle name Thomas, after Clara's father. As Lucas held his newborn son while Ellie peered at her baby brother with wonder, and Clara rested exhausted but glowing in their bed, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. One day. That's all it was supposed to be. One day of pretending so Ellie could feel normal at the harvest blessing. One day that had turned into a lifetime. What are you thinking? Clara asked softly, watching him with those honey gold eyes that still made his heart skip. I'm thinking about a desperate rancher who walked into a general store with a crazy plan, Lucas said, and about a proud woman who said yes when she should have said no, and about how the best things in life are usually the ones we never saw coming. Clara smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made Lucas's world feel complete. Come here, she said, patting the bed beside her. Lucas carefully handed James to Ellie, who held him with surprising competence for a 5-year-old, then climbed into bed next to Clara. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they watched their children together, Ellie cooing at her baby brother, the infant already rooting toward her with instinctive trust. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in white. The roses were dormant now, waiting for spring, but Lucas knew they'd bloom again. Everything did eventually, if you gave it the right care and attention and love. In town, people would talk. They always did. Some would remember the scandal of how Lucas and Clara got together, would whisper about transactions and propriety and unseemly haste. But those whispers would fade eventually, drowned out by the evidence of a family that clearly loved each other, by the sight of Clara and Lucas working side by side, by Ellie's joy and little James's healthy cries. The McGraw Ranch would go on, season after season, year after year. There would be more children eventually, 2 more daughters who would grow up hearing the story of how their parents met, Though the story would become softer and more romantic in the retelling, there would be hard times, droughts and illnesses, and the normal struggles of life. But there would also be good times, more good than bad, because that's what happened when people chose to love each other not just once, but every day. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, and Lucas and Clara sat together watching the stars, they would sometimes talk about that first day, about how a one-day promise had become a forever commitment, about how pretending had turned into the most genuine thing either of them had ever experienced. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked once, years later. "Asking me?" "Not for a single second," Lucas replied, and he meant it. "Do you regret saying yes?" Clara was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she smiled, that beautiful smile that still made Lucas's heart race even after years of marriage. "I regret that I almost said no, that I almost let pride and fear stop me from taking the biggest chance of my life. But saying yes? Never. Not once." They kissed then, still finding joy in the simple act of being close to each other, and Lucas thought about all the ways life could surprise you, about how the things that seemed like endings could actually be beginnings, about how love didn't always look the way you expected it to, but that didn't make it any less real. In Sage Hollow, Wyoming, they would tell the story for generations, about the lonely rancher who asked a stranger to be his date for one day, and the proud teacher who said yes, and how that one day bloomed into a love story that reminded everyone who heard it that second chances were real, that families could be chosen as well as born, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was to open your heart when you'd every reason to keep it closed. One day became forever. And forever, it turned out, was more than enough time to build a life worth living.